There are places in the North Cascades where navigation becomes a matter of instinct rather than instrument. Desolation Peak rises 7,900 feet above the forests of northern Washington, a granite summit wrapped in silence and long views. Jack Kerouac spent a summer there in 1956, alone in a fire lookout, writing about the wind and the weight of solitude. The trail that leads to the peak is steep and unforgiving. It climbs through old-growth cedar and hemlock before breaking into alpine meadows where the air thins and the horizon opens into ridgelines that stretch toward Canada. For decades, it has been a place where people go to disappear into themselves, but in the early 1980s, something else began to happen there, something that had nothing to do with solitude. The eastern ridge of Desolation Peak is not the most dramatic feature of the mountain. It lacks the sheer drops and ice fields that draw technical climbers. It is a long, gradual slope covered in loose scree and sparse juniper. Hikers pass through it on their way to the summit, pausing only to catch their breath or check their bearings. But in the summer of 1983, 3 different groups reported the same disturbance in the same location. Their compasses stopped working. Not gradually, not with the slow drift of magnetic declination. They spun, wildly, without pattern. And then, after several minutes, they stabilized again. The first report came from a father and son who had been hiking the Desolation Peak Trail in late June. The father, a retired engineer named Harold Voss, later described the moment in a letter to the National Park Service. He wrote that his compass began to rotate clockwise, then counterclockwise, then stopped entirely before resuming its erratic movement. He checked his son's compass. It behaved the same way. They were standing at roughly 6,200 feet, just past a flat section of trail where the trees thinned out and the ridge turned northeast. Voss marked the location on his map. He noted the time, 11:40 in the morning. When they moved 20 yards farther up the trail, the compasses returned to normal. 2 weeks later, a group of 3 college students from Seattle reported a similar experience. They had camped near Desolation Lookout the night before and were descending the eastern ridge when their compasses began to malfunction. One of them, a geology student named Rebecca Lindgren, later told a ranger that she thought her compass was broken, but when she compared it to her friends' compasses, all 3 were spinning in unison. She described the sensation of standing there, watching the needles whip back and forth, as deeply unsettling, not because of what was happening, but because of where it was happening. She said the silence felt thicker than it should have, like the air itself had gone still in a way that didn't match the wind moving through the trees below them. The third report came in August. A solo hiker named Thomas Rainey, a cartographer by profession, submitted a formal incident report to the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest Office. He had been carrying 2 compasses, a standard orienteering model and a surveyor's compass he used for his work. Both malfunctioned at the same elevation, in the same location the others had described. Rainey went further. He returned to the site 3 days later with a handheld GPS unit, a magnetic field detector, and a notebook. The GPS functioned normally. The magnetic field detector showed no unusual readings. But the compasses still spun. Park rangers were skeptical at first. Magnetic anomalies are not unheard of in wilderness areas. Deposits of magnetite or lodestone can interfere with compass needles, particularly in regions with volcanic geology. The North Cascades are part of the Cascade Range, a volcanic arc that has been tectonically active for millions of years. But Desolation Peak itself is not volcanic. It is composed primarily of metamorphic rock, gneiss and schist, formed under pressure deep beneath the Earth's surface and later uplifted. There are no known iron deposits in the immediate area, no historical mining activity, no geological surveys that would suggest a localized magnetic disturbance. Still, the reports were consistent enough to warrant attention. In September of 1983, 2 rangers hiked to the location with a geologist from the University of Washington. They carried compasses, magnetometers, and a portable seismograph. They found nothing. The compasses worked perfectly. The magnetometers detected only the Earth's normal magnetic field. The seismograph recorded no unusual subsurface activity. The geologist, Dr. Philip Torrance, later wrote in his field notes that the site was geologically unremarkable. He suggested that the earlier reports may have been the result of user error, equipment malfunction, or atmospheric conditions that temporarily affected the instruments. But the hikers had not imagined it, and the disturbances did not stop. Over the next decade, sporadic reports continued to surface. Not every hiker experienced the phenomenon, but those who did described it in nearly identical terms. The compasses would begin to spin at the same elevation within a 50-yard radius of the same spot. Some reported that their watches stopped briefly. Others mentioned a faint pressure in their ears, like the sensation of rapid altitude change, even though they were standing still. A few described a low hum, barely audible, like the distant vibration of electrical wires, though there were no power lines within miles. In 1991, a backcountry ranger named Elliot Merrick began keeping his own record of the reports. He had heard the stories from other rangers and from hikers who mentioned it in passing. He was skeptical, but curious. Marek hiked to the site multiple times over the course of 2 summers. On his 4th visit in July of 1992, his compass spun. He stood there for 20 minutes, watching the needle whip back and forth, and then walked 30 yards in every direction to test the boundary of the effect. It was localized, precise. He could step into it and out of it like crossing a threshold. Marek reported his findings to his supervisor, who passed the information to the regional office of the National Park Service. No follow-up investigation was conducted. When Marek asked why, he was told that the Park Service did not have the resources to investigate every anomaly reported in the backcountry. He was also told informally that publicizing the phenomenon could create unnecessary concern among hikers or attract curiosity seekers to an already fragile alpine environment. But there was something else, something that had been left out of the official reports. In 1952, a surveying team from the United States Geological Survey was conducting a topographic mapping project in the North Cascades. They were tasked with establishing geodetic control points, permanent markers that serve as reference points for future maps. One of these points was placed on the eastern ridge of Desolation Peak. It was a standard brass cap set into a cairn of stacked stone. The survey notes from that summer are available in the National Archives. But the notes from the final week of the project are missing. The last entry, dated August 19, 1952, mentions that the crew was preparing to finalize the control point on Desolation Peak. The next entry, dated August 27th, indicates that the crew had moved to a different location. There is no mention of what happened in between. In 1987, a historian researching early USGS surveys in Washington discovered a brief memo in an unrelated file. It was written by the crew chief of the Desolation Peak Survey, a man named Leonard Hubbard. The memo was addressed to his supervisor and marked for internal use only. It stated that the control point on the eastern ridge had been removed and relocated to a different section of the mountain. Hubbard wrote that the original site was unsuitable for geodetic purposes, and that the decision had been made in consultation with field personnel. He did not elaborate. The memo was 2 sentences long. No one knows why the cairn was removed, no one knows what made the site unsuitable, and no one knows if the removal had anything to do with what hikers began reporting 30 years later. Elliot Merrick retired from the Park Service in 2004. He still lives near the North Cascades. He no longer hikes Desolation Peak. When asked about the compass anomaly, he says only that he has no explanation for it. But he does remember something that has stayed with him. On his last visit to the site in the summer of 1993, he stood in the center of the affected area and looked around. The ridge was silent. No wind, no birdsong. He noticed that the shadows from the surrounding peaks did not quite align with the position of the sun. It was a small discrepancy, just a few degrees, but it was enough to make him feel like he was standing somewhere that did not match the map in his hand. He left before dark. He has not returned since. Sound travels at a fixed speed, except when it doesn't. Forbidden Peak stands at 8,900 feet in the North Cascades, a technical climb that requires ice axes, crampons, and experience with glacial terrain. The mountain earned its name not from any documented tragedy, but from the sheer difficulty of its approaches. The West Ridge route is considered a classic alpine climb, involving exposed rock scrambling, snow slopes that can avalanche without warning, and several sections where climbers must navigate around or over deep crevasses carved into the Boston Glacier. It is remote, serious, and unforgiving. Climbers who attempt it do so knowing that rescue, if needed, may take days. The nearest road is more than 10 miles away. Cell service is non-existent. In summer, the mountain sees perhaps 24 summit attempts. In winter, it sees none. The Boston Glacier that wraps around Forbidden Peak's northern face is a remnant of the last ice age, a river of ice that moves inches per year, grinding the bedrock beneath it into powder. Crevasses open and close with the seasons, some narrow enough to step over, others wide enough to swallow a person without trace. Climbers rope together when crossing glaciers for this reason. They probe the snow ahead of them with ice axes, listening for the hollow sound that indicates empty space below. The crevasses on Forbidden Peak are known to be particularly deep. Some have been measured at over 100 feet. Others have never been measured at all. In late August of 1997, a team of 4 climbers began their ascent of the West Ridge. They were experienced. All had climbed in the Cascades before. 2 were members of a mountaineering club in Seattle. The other 2 were brothers from Oregon who had summited Mount Rainier earlier that summer. They left the trailhead at Cascade Pass before dawn, hiking 7 miles to a base camp at the edge of the Boston Glacier. The next day, they began the technical portion of the climb. The weather was clear, the snow was stable. By early afternoon, they had reached the base of a large crevasse system at approximately 7,500 feet. The lead climber, a man named David Kowalski, stopped to assess the route. The crevasse in front of him was roughly 8 feet wide and ran perpendicular to their line of travel. It was too wide to step across and too deep to see the bottom. The walls were blue ice, smooth and vertical. Kowalski leaned over the edge and shouted into it. It was something climbers do, half out of curiosity, half out of caution, testing the depth, listening for the return. The others joined him. They shouted together. Their voices echoed back almost immediately, sharp and clear the way sound behaves in enclosed spaces. They crossed the crevasse using an ice bridge 30 yards to the east and continued climbing. By late afternoon, they had reached the summit. They took photographs, ate energy bars, and began their descent. They arrived back at base camp just after sunset, cooked dinner, and settled into their tents. The temperature dropped. The sky was cloudless. At 3:14 a.m., Kowalski woke to the sound of voices. He later described it as hearing his own voice and the voices of his teammates shouting in unison, the same shouts they had made into the crevasse 17 hours earlier. The sound was faint but unmistakable. It seemed to come from the direction of the glacier, carried on still air. Kowalski unzipped his tent and stepped outside. The others were already awake. They had all heard it. They stood together in the dark, listening, but the sound did not repeat. It had lasted only a few seconds, just long enough for them to recognize their own words coming back to them across a distance that should not have been possible. One of the brothers, Michael Pruitt, checked his watch. He wrote down the time. The other climbers did the same. When they returned to Seattle 3 days later, they compared their notes. All four had recorded the same time, 3:14 a.m., 17 hours and 11 minutes after they had shouted into the crevasse. David Kowalski was a physicist by training. He taught at a community college in Tacoma and had published papers on wave mechanics. He knew that sound, under normal conditions, travels at approximately 767 miles per hour at sea level, slower at higher altitudes where the air is thinner. An echo occurs when sound waves reflect off a surface and return to the listener. The delay depends on distance. A shout into a canyon might echo back in 2 or 3 seconds if the canyon wall is a quarter mile away. A shout into a crevasse might echo back almost instantly if the ice at the bottom is only 100 feet down. But 17 hours was not possible. Sound does not linger in the air. It dissipates. It spreads outward in all directions until it becomes too faint to hear. There is no mechanism in physics that allows sound to delay its return by 17 hours. Kowalski tried to construct an explanation. He considered the possibility that they had misheard something else, wind perhaps, or falling ice. But the others disagreed. Michael Pruitt said he had heard his own voice clearly. His brother Daniel said the same. The fourth climber, a woman named Sarah Tomlinson, described it as hearing a recording of herself played back from a distance. She said it was unsettling not because it was loud, but because it was precise. The words were the same. The rhythm was the same. Even the tone was identical to what they had shouted that afternoon. When they returned to civilization, Kowalski contacted the North Cascades National Park Service to report the incident. He was not sure what kind of report to file. There had been no emergency. No one had been injured. But he felt the event was unusual enough to document. He spoke with a ranger named Thomas Bellingham, who listened politely and then suggested that the team had likely experienced an auditory illusion caused by fatigue and altitude. Bellingham noted that climbers at high elevation often report sensory distortions, seeing movement where there is none, hearing voices in the wind, feeling watched in empty places. He thanked Kowalski for the report and said it would be included in the park's incident log. But Kowalski was not satisfied. He reached out to colleagues in the physics department at the University of Washington. He described the event in technical terms, focusing on the time delay and the acoustic properties of glacial ice. One professor, Dr. Angela Mendez, suggested that the crevasse might have acted as a resonant cavity, trapping sound waves in a standing wave pattern. But even she admitted that such a pattern would decay within seconds, not hours. Another colleague proposed that temperature inversions in the atmosphere could bend sound waves, causing them to travel farther than expected. But temperature inversions do not delay sound. They redirect it. And even if the sound had traveled hundreds of miles before returning, it would have been too faint to hear by the time it arrived. Kowalski wrote a detailed account of the experience and submitted it to a journal that published papers on atmospheric acoustics. The paper was rejected. The reviewers noted that while the account was interesting, it lacked sufficient data to support any testable hypothesis. One reviewer commented that without recordings or additional witnesses, the event could not be verified and therefore could not be considered scientifically meaningful. In 2003, a separate climbing party reported a similar experience on Forbidden Peak. They had been descending the same route when they stopped near a crevasse at approximately the same elevation. One of the climbers, a man named Eric Johansson, later told a friend that they had heard voices coming from the ice. He described it as sounding like people calling out from deep below the surface. The voices were faint and indistinct, but they lasted long enough for the entire team to hear them. Johansson did not report the incident to park authorities. When asked why, he said he did not think anyone would believe him. In 2009, another group climbing Forbidden Peak made a note in their summit log about hearing delayed echoes near the Boston Glacier. They did not provide details. The log entry was brief. It read, "Weird acoustics near the Big Crevasse. Voices came back hours later. Probably just wind." The National Park Service has no official record of acoustic anomalies on Forbidden Peak. When asked about the reports, a spokesperson said that unusual sounds in alpine environments are not uncommon and are typically caused by natural phenomena such as ice movement, rockfall, or wind patterns. The spokesperson noted that glaciers are constantly shifting and that the sounds they produce can be startling to those unfamiliar with them. No formal investigation has been conducted. David Kowalski still climbs in the North Cascades. He has returned to Forbidden Peak twice since 1997. He has not shouted into a crevasse again. When asked why, he says only that he does not want to wait 17 hours to hear his own voice come back. Sarah Tomlinson, one of the other climbers from that trip, later described the experience in an interview with a mountaineering magazine. She said the strangest part was not the delay itself, but the feeling that something had been listening the entire time. She could not explain what she meant by that. She said it was just a sense she had, standing there in the dark, hearing her own words return to her from a place that should have been empty. The crevasse is still there. It opens wider in summer and narrows in winter, shifting with the movement of the glacier. Climbers still cross it on their way to the summit. Some pause at the edge and look down into the blue ice. Most do not shout. They move on quietly, roped together, testing the snow ahead of them, listening for the hollow sound that means there is nothing below. Time stops differently in deep water. Lake Chelan is the third deepest lake in the United States, plunging 1,486 feet at its deepest point. It stretches 55 miles through the North Cascades of Washington State, a narrow fjord-like body of water carved by glaciers during the Pleistocene epoch. The lake's southern end is wide and accessible, populated by vacation homes and marinas. But the northern basin is different. It narrows into a corridor of steep granite walls and cold water that remains near freezing even in summer. The town of Stehekin sits at the far northern tip, accessible only by boat, float plane, or a 30-mile hike. There are no roads in, no roads out. The lake itself becomes the only passage, and it is not a forgiving one. The water temperature in the northern basin rarely rises above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Drowning victims who go under in water that cold often sink rapidly, their bodies pulled down by the weight of clothing and the shock of hypothermia. Search and recovery operations in Lake Chelan can take days or weeks. The depth makes sonar unreliable. The steep underwater cliffs create pockets where bodies can become lodged in places divers cannot reach. In some cases, bodies are never recovered at all. Between 1970 and 2000, the Chelan County Sheriff's Office documented 43 drownings in the lake. 18 of those occurred in the northern basin. 9 of those victims were wearing wristwatches when they were recovered. The first case was in July of 1979. A 23-year-old man named Colin Rafferty drowned while swimming near the mouth of Fish Creek, roughly 12 miles south of Stehekin. He had been camping with friends and had gone into the water alone in the early evening. His friends reported him missing when he did not return to shore. His body was found 3 days later by a search and recovery diver at a depth of 210 feet. Rafferty had been wearing a stainless steel wristwatch, a Swiss-made mechanical model with a leather band. When the coroner examined the body, he noted that the watch had stopped. The hands were frozen at 11:34. The coroner recorded the detail in his report, but did not comment on it. The official cause of death was drowning due to cold water immersion. The time of death was estimated to have occurred between 7 and 8 p.m. based on witness statements. In August of 1982, a 16-year-old girl named Amanda Vasquez drowned during a family boating trip near Domka Falls. She had been tubing behind the boat when she fell off and did not surface. Her body was recovered 2 days later at a depth of 190 feet. She had been wearing a small analog watch with a silver-plated case. The watch had stopped at 11:34. The coroner noted the detail in his report. The time of death was estimated to have occurred around 2 p.m. in June of 1913. 84. A 37-year-old man named Gerald Okamoto drowned while kayaking near Prince Creek. His body was found 1 week later at a depth of 240 feet. He had been wearing a waterproof diving watch, a Japanese-made automatic model rated to 300 meters. The watch had stopped at 11:34. The coroner noted the detail. The estimated time of death was late morning. By 1987, 4 more drowning victims had been recovered from the northern basin. All had been wearing analog wristwatches. All of the watches had stopped at 11:34. None of the deaths had occurred at that time. The coroner at that time, a man named Dr. Frank Bittner, began to notice the pattern. He mentioned it to a colleague during a conference in Spokane. The colleague, a forensic pathologist, suggested that water pressure or cold could cause mechanical watches to stop at a similar time if the internal mechanisms were similarly affected. But Dr. Bittner was not convinced. The watches were different brands, different mechanisms, different levels of water resistance. Some were inexpensive models. Others were high-end pieces designed for deep diving. There was no reason they should all fail at the same time. Dr. Bittner reviewed the autopsy reports from all 7 cases. He noted the times of death, the locations of recovery, the depths, and the conditions of the bodies. He found no other commonalities. The victims ranged in age from 16 to 53. They had died in different months, different years, different circumstances. Some had been strong swimmers, others had not. The only consistent detail was the watches. All stopped at 11:34. In 1988, Dr. Bittner sent a letter to the Chelan County Sheriff's Office requesting that future drowning recoveries include a detailed examination of any personal effects, particularly wristwatches. He did not explain why. The letter was filed, and no formal policy was implemented. But the sheriff's deputies began to take note. When an 8th drowning victim, a woman named Patricia Lund, was recovered in 1989, her watch had also stopped at 11:34. The deputy who documented the recovery mentioned it in his report. The report was passed to Dr. Bittner, who added it to his records. In 1991, a 9th victim, a man named Trevor Walsh, was recovered near Lucerne. His watch, a vintage Swiss model from the 1960s, had stopped at 11:34. Dr. Bittner wrote a memo summarizing his findings and submitted it to the Chelan County Medical Examiner's Office. He noted that 9 out of 9 recovered drowning victims in the northern basin over a 12-year period had been wearing watches that stopped at the same time. He requested a formal investigation into the phenomenon. He suggested consulting with horologists, physicists, or anyone who could explain the mechanical consistency. The memo was acknowledged, but no investigation was opened. Dr. Bittner retired in 1993. His successor, Dr. Caroline Dreyfus, reviewed the files and found the memo in the archives. She later said in an interview with a local newspaper that she found the detail curious but not necessarily significant. She pointed out that mechanical watches are sensitive instruments and that water damage, pressure changes, and cold could cause them to stop. She also noted that the number of cases was small and that 9 incidents over 12 years did not constitute a statistically meaningful pattern. But Dr. Dreyfus did not explain why all 9 watches stopped at the same time. She did not explain why some of the watches were designed to withstand far greater depths and pressures than those at which the bodies were found. She did not explain why digital watches recovered from drowning victims in the same lake during the same period showed no such pattern. When pressed by the reporter, she said only that mechanical watches are unpredictable and that the phenomenon, while unusual, was likely coincidental. The families of the victims were never informed of the pattern. Most did not ask about the watches. They were focused on the loss itself, on the fact that their loved ones had drowned in cold, deep water and had been recovered days or weeks later. The watches were returned to the families along with other personal effects. Some families kept them, others did not. At least 2 of the watches were later examined by watchmakers who were asked if the mechanisms could be repaired. Both watchmakers reported that the watches had suffered water damage, but that the internals were otherwise intact. One watchmaker, a man named Lawrence Pilcher, noted that the watch he examined, a diving watch recovered from Gerald Okamoto, should not have failed at the depth where the body was found. He said the watch was rated to depths far beyond 240 feet, and that the seals appeared to be intact. He could not explain why it had stopped. When asked if he could determine the exact moment of failure, he said it was not possible. The watch had simply stopped at 11:34. In 2002, a journalist writing a feature on Lake Chelan's history came across Dr. Bittner's memo while researching old coroner's reports. She reached out to Dr. Bittner, who was living in retirement in Wenatchee. He agreed to an interview, but asked that his name not be used prominently. He told her that he had spent years trying to understand the watches. He had consulted with experts in horology, metallurgy, and underwater forensics. None of them could offer a satisfactory explanation. He said the most troubling part was not that the watches stopped, but that they all stopped at the same time, regardless of when the victims had died. The journalist asked if he thought there was something unusual about Lake Chelan itself. Dr. Bittner paused before answering. He said he did not believe in supernatural explanations. He believed in evidence and data. But he also said that the northern basin of Lake Chelan was unlike any other body of water he had encountered in his career. He said the depth, the cold, and the isolation created conditions that were not fully understood. He said it was possible that something about the environment, some combination of pressure, temperature, and magnetic fields, could affect mechanical instruments in ways that had not been documented. But he also said that possibility did not explain the precision. 11:34. Every time. The article was published in a regional magazine in 2003. It received little attention. No further investigation was conducted. The Chelan County Sheriff's Office declined to comment. The current medical examiner's office stated that drowning investigations focus on cause of death, not on the condition of personal effects. Since 1991, no additional cases have been reported. Either no drowning victims in the northern basin have been recovered wearing analog watches, or the detail has not been documented. Dr. Bittner passed away in 2011. His files on the watches were donated to the Chelan County Historical Society, where they remain in storage, largely unexamined. Lake Chelan is still one of the most popular recreational destinations in Washington state. Thousands of people swim, boat, and fish in its waters every summer. Most stay in the southern basin, where the water is warmer and the shoreline is accessible. Those who venture north do so knowing the risks. The water is deep, the cold is severe, and if something goes wrong, help is far away. There is no memorial for the 9 victims whose watches stopped at 11:34. Their names are listed in county records, their deaths documented as accidental drownings. The watches themselves are gone, dispersed to families, or lost to time. But the pattern remains, recorded in coroner's reports that few people have read and fewer still have questioned. 11:34, not the time of death, just the time the watches chose to stop. Some trails feel like they're watching you walk. Others feel like they're breathing. Thunder Creek Trail runs 18 miles into the heart of North Cascades National Park, following a glacial valley carved during the last ice age. The trail begins at the southern end of Diablo Lake, where the water glows an unnatural turquoise from glacial sediment suspended in the depths. From there, the path winds through old-growth forest, Douglas fir, western red cedar, and hemlock trees that have stood for centuries. The trail is popular with backpackers heading to campsites deeper in the wilderness, but it is also quiet enough that hikers can walk for hours without seeing another person. The valley itself is narrow, hemmed in by steep ridges on both sides. Thunder Creek flows alongside the trail for most of its length, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. The sound of rushing water is constant. The air is damp and cool, even in summer. It is the kind of place where people go to feel small. At milepost 4.2, the trail passes through a section of forest that looks no different from any other. The trees are tall. The undergrowth is thick with ferns and moss. The trail itself is well maintained, wide enough for single-file hiking, with a gentle incline that follows the contour of the valley floor. There are no switchbacks here, no steep climbs or rocky outcrops. It is an unremarkable stretch of trail, but hikers who pass through it often stop. Not because they see something unusual, because they feel it. The first documented report came in September of 1994. A solo hiker named Gregory Ames was walking the trail on a clear autumn day when he noticed something strange beneath his feet. He later described it in a letter to the National Park Service as a sensation of the ground moving. Not shaking, not vibrating, but rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic pattern. He wrote that it felt like standing on the chest of something enormous and asleep. He stopped walking and stood still to confirm what he was feeling. The movement continued. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but consistent. He estimated the rhythm at roughly 6 to 8 seconds between each rise and fall. He walked forward another 50 yards and the sensation stopped. He walked back and it resumed. He marked the location on his map and continued his hike. When Ames returned to the trailhead, he mentioned the experience to a ranger at the Colonial Creek campground. The ranger, a woman named Patricia Delacroix, had worked in the park for 12 years and had never heard of such a thing. She suggested that Ames might have been experiencing vertigo or a mild earthquake. Ames insisted that he had felt neither dizzy nor unsteady. He said the ground itself had been moving, not his perception of it. Delacroix made a note of the conversation, but did not file an official report. Over the next several years, similar accounts began to surface. In June of 1996, a couple from Portland reported feeling the same sensation at what they believed was the same location. They described it as the trail breathing beneath them in August of 1990. A group of 3 backpackers stopped at milepost 4.2 and noticed that the ground seemed to pulse in unison. One of them, a man named Luis Tavares, later told a friend that it felt synchronized, as if the entire section of trail was moving together. He said they stood there for several minutes, watching the dirt and trying to see if it was visible. It was not, but they could all feel it through their boots. By 2001, enough reports had accumulated that Patricia Delacroix decided to investigate. She hiked the trail alone on a Tuesday in early October, carrying a notebook and a handheld GPS unit. When she reached milepost 4.2, she stopped and stood still. She felt it immediately. A slow, rhythmic rise and fall beneath her feet. She knelt down and placed her hand flat on the ground. The movement was faint but unmistakable. She walked the perimeter of the affected area, marking waypoints with her GPS. The phenomenon was localized to a stretch of trail roughly 120 feet long. Outside that boundary, the ground was stable. Delacroix returned to the ranger station and filed a formal incident report. She recommended that a geologist be brought in to assess the site. Her supervisor, a man named Dennis Kohlberg, reviewed the report and forwarded it to the park's chief of resource management. 3 weeks later, Delacroix was informed that a geological survey team from the University of Washington would visit the site in the spring. The survey team arrived in May of 2002. They consisted of 2 graduate students and a professor of geophysics named Dr. Ramesh Kulkarni. They carried seismometers, ground-penetrating radar, and soil testing equipment. They spent 2 days at the site, taking measurements and recording data. The seismometers detected faint oscillations in the ground, micro-movements that occurred at regular intervals of approximately 7 seconds. The oscillations were too small to be felt by instruments alone, but when combined with the sensitivity of human proprioception, the body's sense of balance and movement, they became perceptible. Dr. Kulkarni described the readings as unusual but not unprecedented. He noted that similar micro-oscillations had been recorded near underground water flows, tectonic faults, and areas of soil subsidence. The ground-penetrating radar, however, revealed no underground water, no fault lines, no voids or cavities that might explain the movement. The soil composition was consistent with the rest of the valley, glacial till and decomposed organic matter, stable and well compacted. Dr. Kulkarni suggested that the oscillations might be caused by subsurface groundwater moving through fractured bedrock, even if that water was too deep or too diffuse to be detected by radar. He said it was possible that the water was flowing in pulses, creating pressure waves that propagated through the soil and produced the rhythmic movement. He also said that without drilling core samples or installing permanent seismic monitoring equipment, it would be difficult to confirm the cause. The Park Service thanked Dr. Kulkarni for his work and filed his report. No further investigation was conducted. No drilling was authorized. The trail remained open and no warning signs were posted. When asked why, Dennis Kohlberg said that the phenomenon posed no safety risk and that there was no reason to alarm hikers over something that was likely a natural hydrological process. But the hikers kept reporting it. In 2004, a woman named Ellen Fujimoto wrote to the Park Service describing the sensation as feeling like the earth was alive. She said she had stopped and stood in the middle of the trail for 10 minutes, trying to understand what she was feeling. She said it was not frightening, but it was deeply unsettling. She said it made her feel like she was standing on something that did not want her there. In 2007, a trail maintenance crew working near milepost 4.2 reported the same phenomenon. One of the crew members, a man named Marcus Whitfield, later told a journalist that the entire crew had felt it. He said they had joked about it at first, calling it the breathing spot, but after a while, the joking stopped. He said it was the kind of thing that you could ignore for a few seconds, but the longer you stood there, the more aware of it you became. He said it felt intentional, like something was trying to get your attention. In 2009, Patricia Delacroix retired from the Park Service. Before she left, she submitted a final memo requesting that the site be reevaluated. She noted that the phenomenon had been consistently reported for 15 years and that the original geological survey had not provided a definitive explanation. She suggested that the seismic data be reviewed by an independent expert and that additional monitoring equipment be installed to track changes over time. Her memo was acknowledged, but no action was taken. In 2012, a seismologist from the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network reviewed Dr. Kulkarni's original data at the request of a graduate student researching unusual seismic activity in national parks. The seismologist, Dr. Yuki Nakamura, noted that the oscillations recorded at Thunder Creek did not match any known natural patterns. She said that groundwater flow, tectonic movement, and soil settling all produce seismic signatures that are irregular and asymmetrical. The oscillations at Thunder Creek were neither. They were rhythmic, consistent, and synchronized across the entire affected area. Dr. Nakamura wrote in her review that the data suggested a source that was localized, regular, and currently unidentified. She recommended further study, but acknowledged that without funding or institutional support, such a study was unlikely to occur. No further study has occurred. The Thunder Creek Trail remains one of the most popular hiking routes in North Cascades National Park. Thousands of people walk it every year. Most pass through milepost 4.2 without stopping. Some notice the sensation and continue on, attributing it to fatigue or uneven footing. A few stop and stand still, trying to understand what they are feeling. Those who do often describe the experience in similar terms. The ground rises and falls, slowly, rhythmically like breathing. There is no plaque at the site, no marker, no explanation posted on trail maps or park websites. The Park Service continues to maintain that the phenomenon is likely a natural geological process. When pressed, they cite Dr. Kulkarni's original report and note that no safety concerns have been identified. They do not mention Dr. Nakamura's review. They do not mention the seismic data that does not match known patterns. They do not mention the hikers who stand in the middle of the trail and feel the earth move beneath them in a rhythm that has no source. Patricia Delacroix still lives near the park. She hikes occasionally but avoids Thunder Creek. When asked why, she says only that she has felt the breathing ground enough times to know it is real. She says she does not need to understand it. She just knows it is there. And that is enough to make her choose a different trail. The oscillations continue. Measured, synchronized, unexplained. Milepost 4.2. 7 seconds between each rise and fall. Always the same. Always waiting. Buildings don't vanish without leaving scars on the land. Ross Lake is a reservoir that stretches 23 miles along the border between Washington State and British Columbia. It was created in 1949 when Seattle City Light completed the Ross Dam on the Skagit River, flooding a narrow valley that had once been home to miners, trappers, and a handful of homesteaders. The lake is remote, accessible only by boat, a long hike from Highway 20, or by water taxi from the town of Diablo. Its shores are steep and forested, broken occasionally by rocky outcrops and small clearings where the forest has not yet reclaimed what was once logged or settled. The water is cold and deep, fed by glacial runoff from the North Cascades. In summer, the lake sees recreational boaters and fishermen. In winter, it is silent and empty, locked in by snow and accessible only to those willing to make the difficult journey in. The western shore near Devil's Creek is particularly isolated. The creek descends from the mountains in a series of waterfalls, pouring into the lake through a steep ravine choked with alder and vine maple. There is no trail along this section of shoreline. The Forest Service maintains a few backcountry campsites on Ross Lake, but none are located near Devil's Creek. The terrain is too steep, the landing too difficult. Boaters occasionally anchor offshore to fish, but few stay long. The area has a reputation for being difficult to navigate and colder than other parts of the lake, even in the height of summer. In 1978, the United States Geological Survey conducted a series of aerial surveys of the North Cascades as part of a broader mapping project. The flights used high-resolution cameras mounted on fixed-wing aircraft, capturing images that would later be used to create topographic maps and land use assessments. One of those images, cataloged as Frame 7-2-14, shows the western shore of Ross Lake near Devil's Creek. In the lower right quadrant of the photograph, partially obscured by tree cover, is a small rectangular structure. It appears to be a cabin, single-story, with a pitched roof and what looks like a stone chimney on the northern end. The structure sits roughly 50 yards from the waterline on a slight rise above the shore. Smoke is visible rising from the chimney. The image is dated July 12, 1978. 4 years later, in 1982, a follow-up survey was conducted using similar equipment and flight paths. The image captured of the same location, cataloged as frame 9-1-22, shows no cabin. The clearing where the structure had stood is still visible, but the cabin itself is gone. There is no debris, no collapsed roof, no charred remains. Just trees and undergrowth, as if the structure had never existed. The discrepancy was not noticed immediately. The images were archived and used primarily for updating topographic maps, a process that involved comparing older surveys with newer ones to track changes in land use, forest cover, and water levels. It was not until 1996 that a cartographer named Helen Sokoloff, working on a project to digitize historical aerial surveys, noticed the cabin in the 1978 image. She cross-referenced it with the 1982 survey and found it missing. She assumed the cabin had been demolished or had collapsed between surveys. But when she checked Forest Service records for demolition permits or incident reports, she found nothing. There was no record of any structure ever being permitted at that location. Sokoloff contacted the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest Office and inquired about the site. She was told that no cabins had been authorized on the western shore of Ross Lake in the 1970s or 80s. A Forest Service historian named Marcus Dillard reviewed the archives and confirmed that the area near Devil's Creek had never been designated for residential or recreational structures. He suggested that the cabin might have been an illegal homestead or a trapper's shelter built before the dam was constructed and the lake was filled. But if that were the case, Dillard noted, the structure would have been flooded when the reservoir was created in 1949. The location in the photograph was well above the high water mark. Sokoloff was not satisfied with the explanation. She obtained copies of older aerial surveys from the 1950s and 60s. None of them showed a cabin at that location. She reviewed satellite imagery from the 1990s. The clearing was still there, but no structure was visible. She contacted the University of Washington's Department of Geography and shared the images with a professor of remote sensing named Dr. Anita Vogel. Dr. Vogel examined the photographs and confirmed that the object in the 1978 image appeared to be a man-made structure. She noted the straight lines of the roof, the symmetry of the building, and the presence of smoke, which suggested active habitation. She could not explain why it was absent in the 1982 survey. In 2001, a journalist writing an article on abandoned structures in the North Cascades came across Sokoloff's findings and decided to investigate. His name was Terrence Abernathy, and he worked for a regional outdoors magazine. Abernathy contacted several longtime residents of the Ross Lake area, including fishermen, guides, and retired Forest Service employees. 3 of them remembered the cabin. A fisherman named Raymond Kovacs, who had spent summers on Ross Lake since the 1960s, said he had seen the cabin multiple times in the mid-70s. He described it as a small, weathered structure with a stone chimney and a wooden dock that extended a short distance into the lake. Kovacs said he had never approached the cabin closely, but had seen smoke coming from the chimney on several occasions. He assumed it was privately owned or operated by someone with a special use permit. He said the last time he saw it was in the summer of 1979. A retired hunting guide named Barbara Nystrom said she had guided clients near Devil's Creek in 1977 and had noticed the cabin from the water. She described it as old but not abandoned, with a neatly stacked woodpile visible near the entrance. She said she had assumed it was a Forest Service cabin or a fire lookout, though she knew of no official lookouts in that area. When Abernathy asked if she had ever tried to visit the cabin, she said no. She said there was something about the location that discouraged approach. She did not elaborate. A third witness, a former Forest Service ranger named Gerald Pritchard, said he had heard rumors of a cabin near Devil's Creek, but had never seen it himself. He said that in the late 70s there had been occasional reports from boaters who claimed to see smoke or lights on the western shore, but when rangers investigated, they found nothing. Pritchard said it was not uncommon for people to mistake shadows, mist, or campfires for structures that were not there. He also said that the western shore was difficult to access and rarely patrolled. If someone had built an illegal cabin there, he said, it might have gone unnoticed for years. Abernathy attempted to visit the site in the summer of 2001. He hired a boat and navigated to the approximate location shown in the 1978 photograph. The clearing was still there, overgrown but identifiable. He hiked inland from the shore and found no evidence of a structure, no foundation stones, no metal hardware, no remnants of a chimney or roof. He searched the surrounding area for more than 3 hours. He found nothing. He took photographs and GPS coordinates and returned to his boat. Later, he compared his GPS data with the coordinates derived from the aerial surveys. He was in the correct location. Abernathy published his article in 2002. The piece included reproductions of the 1978 and 1982 aerial photographs, along with interviews from Kovacs, Nystrom, and Pritchard. The article raised questions about how a cabin could appear in one survey and vanish in another without any record of demolition or removal. It suggested that the structure might have been dismantled and removed by its occupants, or that it had been destroyed by fire or flood and the debris had been cleared away. But it offered no definitive answers. The Forest Service responded to the article with a brief statement. They reiterated that no structures had been permitted at the location in question and that any unauthorized cabin would have been subject to removal under federal regulations. They noted that the aerial photograph from 1978 might have been misinterpreted or mislabeled, and that the object identified as a cabin could have been a shadow, a natural formation, or an artifact of the photographic process. They did not address the witness accounts or explain why the clearing was visible in both surveys. In 2007, Dr. Vogel conducted a follow-up analysis using digital enhancement techniques on the 1978 image. She concluded that the structure was consistent with a cabin and that the smoke visible in the photograph was not an artifact or optical illusion. She noted that the angle of the roof, the dimensions of the building, and the presence of a chimney all suggested deliberate construction. She also noted that the image quality was sufficient to rule out misidentification. In her report, she wrote that the cabin had been real, occupied, and then removed or destroyed between 1978 and 1982. She could not explain the absence of debris or records. No further investigation has been conducted. The site remains unmarked and unvisited except by the occasional fisherman who anchors offshore. The clearing is still visible in satellite imagery, a pale scar in the dense forest, but no one has reported seeing a structure there since 1979. The 1978 photograph remains in the USGS archives, cataloged and accessible to researchers. The cabin is there, captured in high-resolution detail. Smoke rises from the chimney. The roof is intact. The location is precise. Helen Sokoloff retired from cartography in 2015. She kept a copy of the photograph on her office wall until the day she left. She has never returned to Ross Lake. When asked why the cabin disappeared, she says only that she does not know. She says the image is real and the witnesses are credible. She says that something was there and then it was not. She says the land does not forget that easily. But sometimes, she says, records do. The clearing near Devil's Creek is still there, silent, empty, waiting for someone to explain what stood there in 1978 and where it went by 1982. The Forest Service says it was never permitted. The witnesses say they saw it. The photograph says it was real. And the land, as always, says nothing at all. There are sounds in the mountains that have no source. Cascade Pass sits at 5,400 feet in North Cascades National Park, a glacial saddle carved between Johannesburg Mountain and Cascade Peak. The trail to the pass is 3.7 miles long, climbing steadily through old-growth forest before breaking into alpine meadows that bloom with wildflowers in late summer. The pass itself offers sweeping views of the Cascade Range, jagged peaks, hanging glaciers, and valleys that drop away into shadow. It is one of the most popular hiking destinations in the park, accessible enough for day hikers but remote enough to feel untouched. The pass has been used for centuries as a route through the mountains, first by the Skagit and Chelan peoples, later by miners and trappers during the gold rush, and now by thousands of visitors each year. It is a place of transition where the landscape shifts from forest to rock to ice, where weather changes rapidly, and where sound behaves in unexpected ways. The acoustics of mountain passes are well documented. Sound can travel great distances in thin air, bending around peaks and reflecting off rock faces in ways that distort both direction and origin. Hikers in the Cascades have reported hearing voices, music, and mechanical sounds that seem to come from nowhere. Most of these phenomena can be explained by the presence of other hikers, distant helicopters, or wind passing through narrow gaps in the terrain. But some sounds resist explanation. In early September of 1989, a solo hiker named Vincent Morales reached Cascade Pass just before dawn. He had camped at the Pelton Basin the night before and had set out early to watch the sunrise from the pass. The morning was clear and windless. Morales later described the silence as complete. No birds, no rustling leaves, no sound of water from the glaciers above. He stood at the pass, facing east, and waited for the sun to rise over the ridgeline. At approximately 6:12 a.m., he heard singing. He described it in a written account as choral music, multiple voices harmonizing in a melody he did not recognize. The sound was faint but distinct, coming from somewhere to the north, in the direction of Johannesburg Mountain. Morales said the voices sounded human, not electronic, and that the melody was complex, with overlapping parts that rose and fell in a pattern that suggested trained singers. He estimated the sound lasted between 30 and 45 seconds before fading. He looked around, but saw no one. He was alone on the pass. The nearest other hikers, a couple camping at Sahali Arm, were more than a mile away and on the opposite side of the valley. Morales was a music teacher by profession. He had sung in choirs for most of his life and was familiar with vocal harmony. He was certain that what he had heard was choral singing, not wind, not animal calls, not auditory hallucination. He stood at the pass for another 20 minutes, listening, but the sound did not return. He continued his hike and descended back to the trailhead later that morning. He mentioned the experience to a ranger at the Marble Mount Ranger Station. The ranger, a man named Thomas Calloway, thanked him for the report and made a note in the daily log. No follow-up was conducted. 15 years later, in August of 2004, another solo hiker reported a nearly identical experience. Her name was Diane Espinoza, a photographer from Bellingham who had hiked to Cascade Pass to capture sunrise images. She arrived at the pass at 5:53 a.m. and set up her camera on a tripod. The morning was cold and still. At approximately 6:08 a.m., she heard singing. She described it as a choir, voices in harmony, distant but clear, coming from the direction of the peaks to the north. The melody was unfamiliar but structured, with distinct vocal lines that moved independently. Espinoza said the sound lasted less than a minute. She immediately reached for her voice recorder, which she carried for taking audio notes about her photographs. She pressed record and aimed the microphone toward the sound. The singing continued for another 10 or 15 seconds and then stopped. When Espinoza played back the recording later that day, she heard nothing but wind. She replayed it multiple times, adjusting the volume and using headphones. There was no singing, just the faint hiss of air moving over the microphone. She was certain she had heard voices. She checked her camera's built-in microphone, which had been recording video at the time. That recording also contained no singing, only wind. Espinoza contacted the National Park Service and filed a report. She described the experience in detail and included the audio and video files. A park naturalist named Karen Lindquist reviewed the files and confirmed that they contained no discernible choral music. Lindquist suggested that Espinoza might have heard wind passing through rock formations, a phenomenon known as aeolian tones, which can produce musical sounds under certain conditions. But Espinoza disagreed. She said the sound had been distinctly vocal, with words she could not quite make out, and that wind did not harmonize in multiple parts. Lindquist noted the report but did not investigate further. She later mentioned it to a colleague, a park ranger named Michael Ostergaard, who had worked in the North Cascades for 18 years. Ostergaard said he had heard similar reports before. He recalled a hiker in the mid-90s who had described hearing singing at Cascade Pass at dawn. Ostergaard did not remember the hiker's name or the exact year, but he said the description had been similar: choral, harmonic, and coming from the northern peaks. He said the hiker had been credible and had seemed genuinely puzzled by the experience. Ostergaard had assumed it was an acoustic anomaly and had not filed a formal report. In 2006, a historian, researching early mining activity in the North Cascades, came across a reference to Cascade Pass in a journal kept by a prospector named William Hargrave. The journal, dated 1893, described Hargrave's journey through the pass in late summer. In one entry, he wrote about hearing singing voices carried on the wind at dawn while camped near the summit. He described the sound as unearthly but not unpleasant, and noted that his companion had also heard it. Hargrave did not elaborate further, and the reference was brief, just a few sentences in a journal that primarily documented weather conditions and ore samples. The historian, a woman named Dr. Sylvia Koresh, found the entry intriguing and cross-referenced it with other historical accounts from the region. She found no additional mentions of singing at Cascade Pass, but she did find a passing reference in a 1927 field report by a Forest Service surveyor named Edward Durbin. Durbin wrote that he had camped at Cascade Pass overnight and had been awakened at dawn by music-like sounds that he could not identify. He attributed them to wind, but noted that they had a rhythmic quality that was unusual. Dr. Koresh contacted the National Park Service and shared her findings. She suggested that the phenomenon might be a recurring acoustic event tied to specific atmospheric or geological conditions at the pass. She proposed that a formal study be conducted using audio recording equipment placed at the site during the summer months, particularly at dawn when the reports had consistently occurred. The Park Service acknowledged her request, but declined to pursue the study. A spokesperson said that the agency did not have the resources to investigate acoustic anomalies and that the phenomenon, if real, posed no safety risk to visitors. In 2009, a third report was filed. A solo hiker named Robert Kiley reached Cascade Pass at dawn on July 19th and heard what he described as a choir singing somewhere in the mountains. He recorded the sound on his smartphone. When he played it back later, the recording contained only ambient noise, wind, the rustle of his jacket, the faint crunch of gravel under his boots. No singing. Kiley was certain he had heard it. He described the melody as repetitive and haunting, with at least 4 distinct vocal parts. He said it had lasted approximately 1 minute and had seemed to move, shifting from the north to the west before fading entirely. Kiley posted about his experience on a hiking forum. Several users responded with skepticism, suggesting he had misheard wind, distant aircraft, or other hikers. One user, however, wrote that they had heard something similar at Cascade Pass in the early 2000s. They did not provide details, but said they had never forgotten the sound. Another user mentioned that indigenous stories from the region spoke of voices in the high places, but did not elaborate. Dr. Koresh attempted to locate Skagit or Chelan oral histories that referenced singing or voices at Cascade Pass. She found no direct references, but did find accounts of the pass being considered a spiritually significant location, a place where the boundary between the physical and non-physical world was thought to be thin. These accounts were fragmentary and had been recorded by anthropologists in the early 20th century. They did not mention singing specifically, but they did describe the pass as a place where the old ones could be heard if one listened carefully at dawn. No formal investigation has been conducted. The National Park Service continues to receive occasional reports of unusual sounds at Cascade Pass, though not all of them involve singing. Some hikers report hearing voices when no one else is present. Others describe music-like tones or rhythmic patterns that seem to come from the peaks. Most of these reports are attributed to wind, echoes, or the psychological effects of solitude and altitude. No recordings have ever captured the phenomenon. Vincent Morales still hikes in the North Cascades. He has returned to Cascade Pass several times since 1989, but has never heard the singing again. When asked what he thinks he heard, he says he does not know. He says it was real, and it was beautiful, and it was not wind. He says he has spent 30 years trying to understand it and has come no closer to an answer. He says the memory of it has not faded. He says he can still hear the melody in his mind, though he has never been able to reproduce it or find anything like it in any music he has encountered since. Diane Espinoza no longer hikes alone. She says the experience at Cascade Pass changed the way she thinks about sound and silence. She says she knows what she heard and she knows the recording captured nothing. She says she does not expect anyone to believe her. She says the mountains keep their own secrets and some things are not meant to be documented. The pass is still there, 5,400 feet, accessible, beautiful, silent at dawn except when it is not. Hikers still arrive in the early morning to watch the sunrise. Most hear nothing but wind. Some hear voices. And a few, standing in the right place at the right time, hear a choir singing a melody no one has ever identified, moving through peaks that have no name, fading into silence before the first light touches the stone. Metal ages differently at certain elevations. Copper Ridge is a high alpine traverse in North Cascades National Park, running along a narrow ridgeline at approximately 6,000 feet. The trail extends 11 miles from Hannigan Pass to the Chilliwack River Valley, offering unobstructed views of Mount Shuksan, Mount Baker, and the glaciated peaks of the northern Cascades. The ridge is exposed, treeless, and prone to sudden weather changes. Winds can reach 50 miles per hour without warning. Fog rolls in from the west, thick and disorienting, obscuring the trail and the drop-offs on either side. The Park Service maintains 3 designated campsites along the ridge, each marked by a simple wooden post and a bare wire strung between 2 metal poles. The sites are primitive: no water, no shelters, no facilities. Backpackers carry everything they need and camp on gravel pads worn flat by decades of use. Campsite 2 sits at roughly 6,100 feet, positioned on a slight saddle between 2 rises in the ridgeline. It offers a marginally flatter sleeping surface than the other sites and is the most frequently used. The ground is a mix of coarse gravel, alpine soil, and exposed bedrock. Wildflowers grow in patches during the brief summer season: lupine, paintbrush, heather. By late September, the ridge is empty. Snow begins to accumulate in October and does not fully melt until July. The campsite is occupied perhaps 40 nights per year, mostly by experienced backpackers who know how to navigate exposed terrain and unpredictable weather. In early August of 2001, a group of 4 backpackers from Tacoma set up camp at Campsite 2. They arrived in the late afternoon after hiking in from Hannigan Pass. The weather was clear and calm. They pitched 2 tents, secured them with aluminum stakes, and hung their food on the bare wire using steel carabiners. They cooked dinner using a lightweight camping stove and stainless steel cookware. One of the hikers, a man named Jonathan Bledsoe, later recalled that everything had been normal when they went to sleep. The sky was full of stars. The temperature was cool, but not uncomfortable. They were the only group on the ridge that night. When they woke the next morning, their gear had changed. The aluminum tent stakes were covered in a fine orange-brown coating. The carabiners hanging from the bare wire were similarly affected. The stainless steel pot they had used for cooking showed patches of discoloration. Bledsoe examined the stakes and realized the coating was rust, or something very much like it. He pulled one of the stakes from the ground and rubbed his thumb across the surface. The rust came off in a powdery residue. He checked the other stakes. All of them were affected, some more than others, but all showed corrosion that had not been present the night before. The group discussed the phenomenon as they packed up. One of the hikers, a woman named Alicia Pardo, suggested it might be condensation combined with mineral-rich soil. Another, a man named Kevin Tanaka, pointed out that aluminum does not rust in the traditional sense. It oxidizes, but the process is slow and the resulting layer is typically gray, not orange. Bledsoe, who worked as an engineer, said the level of corrosion they were seeing would normally take weeks or months to develop, not 12 hours. They took photographs of the affected gear and continued their hike. When they returned to civilization, Bledsoe contacted the North Cascades National Park Service to report the incident. He described what they had found and sent digital photographs via email. A park ranger named Samuel Orozco reviewed the report and replied that the phenomenon was likely caused by condensation interacting with trace minerals in the soil or airborne particles. Orozco noted that high-altitude environments can create unusual chemical conditions and that the group's gear may have been exposed to moisture that accelerated oxidation. He thanked them for the report and filed it in the park's incident log. Bledsoe was not entirely satisfied with the explanation. He kept the corroded tent stakes and later showed them to a colleague who specialized in materials science. The colleague examined the stakes under magnification and confirmed that the coating was consistent with iron oxide, rust. But aluminum does not contain iron. The colleague suggested that the stakes might have been contaminated with iron particles from another source, perhaps during manufacturing or through contact with other metal objects. Bledsoe accepted the explanation but remained puzzled by the speed and uniformity of the corrosion. 7 years later, in September of 2008, another group reported a similar experience at the same campsite. This time, the hikers were a couple from Bellingham, Martin and Jessica Kowalczyk. They had camped at Campsite 2 on a clear night in early autumn. When they woke, they found that their tent stakes, a small folding knife, and several carabiners had developed a layer of rust overnight. Martin later told a friend that the rust had been so thick on the tent stakes that he initially thought someone had vandalized their camp. He said the corrosion looked like it had been there for months, not hours. The Kowalczyks did not report the incident to the Park Service. Martin mentioned it in passing to a ranger at the Glacier Public Service Center when they returned from their hike, but he did not file a formal report. The ranger, a seasonal employee whose name was not recorded, suggested that the altitude and moisture might have caused the issue. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, and no follow-up was conducted. In 2016, a solo backpacker named Adrienne Callahan camped at Campsite 2. She had been hiking the Copper Ridge Loop over 3 days and had chosen the site because of its views. The evening was cold and windy, but clear. Callahan set up her tent, secured it with titanium stakes, and went to sleep around 9 p.m. When she woke at dawn, the stakes were covered in rust. She also noticed that a small multi-tool she had left outside the tent, clipped to the exterior pocket of her backpack, was similarly affected. The tool's stainless steel blades and the aluminum handle both showed signs of corrosion. Callahan was a geologist by training. She recognized that what she was seeing did not align with normal oxidation processes. Titanium is highly resistant to corrosion. Stainless steel is designed to resist rust. And aluminum, as she well knew, forms a protective oxide layer that prevents further degradation. She took samples of the rust using a small plastic bag and photographed the affected items. When she returned home, she had the samples analyzed by a lab at the university where she worked. The analysis confirmed the presence of iron oxide, along with trace amounts of other metal oxides. But the report offered no explanation for how the corrosion had occurred so rapidly or why it had affected metals that should have been resistant. Callahan contacted the National Park Service and submitted a detailed report, including photographs, lab results, and a description of the conditions at the campsite. Her report was reviewed by a natural resources specialist named Dr. Felipe Montero, who had a background in geochemistry. Dr. Montero found the report intriguing, but could not offer a definitive explanation. He noted that the ridge was composed primarily of metamorphic rock, gneiss and schist, which contained trace amounts of iron. He suggested that under specific atmospheric conditions, perhaps involving moisture, temperature inversions, and mineral dust, the iron particles could become chemically active and adhere to nearby metal surfaces, creating the appearance of accelerated corrosion. But Dr. Montero also acknowledged that the conditions required for such a process would be unusual, and that the phenomenon's recurrence at the same campsite over a 15-year period was difficult to explain. He recommended that monitoring equipment be installed at the site to measure temperature, humidity, and particulate composition during the summer months. His recommendation was noted but not acted upon. The Park Service cited budget constraints and the logistical difficulty of maintaining equipment at a high-altitude, remote location. In 2018, a journalist writing about unusual natural phenomena in the Cascades came across Callahan's report while researching park records. The journalist, a woman named Leah Sorensen, contacted Callahan and learned about the earlier incidents involving Bledsoe and the Kowalczyks. Sorensen reached out to all three parties and compiled their accounts. She also interviewed Dr. Montero and reviewed the limited data available on atmospheric and geological conditions at Copper Ridge. Sorensen's article, published in a Regional Outdoors magazine, raised the possibility that Campsite 2 was situated in a location where unique environmental factors, possibly related to wind patterns, mineral composition, or electromagnetic conditions, created a microenvironment conducive to rapid metal oxidation. She noted that similar phenomena had been observed in other parts of the world, often in coastal or volcanic regions where salt, sulfur, or other reactive compounds were present in the air. But Copper Ridge was neither coastal nor volcanic. The source of the corrosive agent, if there was one, remained unclear. The article generated some interest among readers, but no formal investigation was launched. The Park Service reiterated that the phenomenon was likely caused by natural processes and posed no safety risk to hikers. They noted that metal corrosion, while unusual, was not dangerous and that backpackers could avoid the issue by using non-metallic gear or by camping at one of the other designated sites along the ridge. Since 2016, no new reports have been filed. Either the phenomenon has stopped or hikers who have experienced it have not reported it. Campsite 2 remains in use. The Park Service has not posted any warnings or advisories. The site is marked on maps and trail guides as one of the standard camping options along the Copper Ridge Loop. Thousands of hikers pass through the area each summer. Most camp without incident. Jonathan Bledsoe still has the corroded tent stakes from 2001. He keeps them in a box in his garage, along with the photographs he took that morning. He has not returned to Copper Ridge. When asked why, he says only that he does not need to. He says he knows what he saw, and he knows it was not normal. He says the stakes were new when he started the hike and covered in rust by morning. He says that fact has not changed in 20 years, and neither has the absence of a satisfactory explanation. Adrienne Callahan has returned to Copper Ridge twice since 2016. Both times, she camped at Campsite 1, farther east along the ridge. She did not camp at Campsite 2. When asked why not, she says the lab results made her curious, not afraid, but that curiosity does not require repetition. She says the rust was real and the speed was impossible. She says those two facts do not reconcile, and she is comfortable not knowing why. The ridge is still there, 6,100 feet, exposed, beautiful. Campsite 2 is marked by a wooden post and a bare wire, the same as the others. The ground is gravel and soil and bedrock. The wind blows, the fog rolls in, and on certain nights, under conditions no one has been able to define, the metal ages. Rapidly, uniformly, without explanation. The gear rusts, the hikers wake, and the ridge, as always, offers no answers. Light does not belong at the bottom of a reservoir. Diablo Lake is a reservoir in the North Cascades, created in 1930 when Seattle City Light completed Diablo Dam on the Skagit River. The lake stretches nearly 5 miles and reaches a maximum depth of 390 feet near the dam face. Its water is an intense turquoise, colored by glacial flour, microscopic rock particles suspended in runoff from nearby glaciers. The lake is surrounded by steep forested slopes and granite cliffs that rise directly from the water's edge. Before the dam was built, the area was home to a small company town called Diablo, which housed workers constructing the dam and the associated hydroelectric infrastructure. When the reservoir filled, most of the town was relocated to higher ground, but some structures, foundations, roads, and remnants of buildings were left in place and now rest beneath the lake's surface. The old town site sits in the northeastern section of the reservoir, roughly half a mile from the current shoreline. At normal water levels, it lies between 80 and 120 feet below the surface. The foundations are accessible to divers, though few visit. The water is cold year-round, visibility is often poor due to silt, and the site holds little of historical interest. Seattle City Light maintains detailed records of what was submerged when the lake was filled, including maps showing the locations of former buildings, utility lines, and roads. None of those records mention structures with glass windows that survived submersion, and none indicate any reason for light to be present at the site. In June of 1996, a fishing guide named Garrett Sullivan was leading a group of clients on Diablo Lake in the early evening. They were trolling near the northeastern shore, close to where the old town site was known to be. The sun had dropped below the western ridgeline, and the lake was entering the blue hour, the period of twilight when natural light fades, but darkness has not yet settled. Sullivan later described what he saw in a report filed with the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office. He said he noticed a faint glow beneath the water, approximately 50 yards from the boat. The glow was rectangular, roughly the size and shape of a window, and appeared to be at a depth of around 90 feet. It was not bright, but it was distinct enough to stand out against the darkening water. Sullivan's clients also saw it. One of them, a man named Peter Voss, later confirmed the sighting in a written statement. Voss said the light looked like it was coming from inside a submerged structure, as though someone had left a lamp on in a room underwater. He said it did not flicker or move. It simply glowed, steady and rectangular, for approximately 3 to 4 minutes before fading and disappearing entirely. Sullivan maneuvered the boat closer to investigate, but by the time they reached the area, the light was gone. He marked the location on his GPS and continued fishing. He mentioned the incident to his clients, but did not dwell on it. He assumed it was some kind of optical illusion or a reflection. 2 weeks later, Sullivan was guiding another group on the lake in similar conditions: early evening, overcast sky, fading light. He was fishing in a different section of the lake when one of his clients pointed toward the water and asked what the light was. Sullivan looked and saw the same rectangular glow, this time in a slightly different location, but still near the old town site. He consulted his GPS and noted the coordinates. The light lasted about 5 minutes and then faded. Sullivan decided to report the sightings to Seattle City Light, which manages the reservoir and the surrounding area. He spoke with a public affairs officer who thanked him for the information and said the company would look into it. No follow-up ever occurred. Over the next several years, additional reports surfaced. In August of 1998, a couple kayaking on the lake saw what they described as a lit window beneath the surface near the same area. They did not report it officially, but mentioned it to a ranger at the North Cascades Visitor Center. In September of 2003, a photographer documenting the lake for a regional magazine saw the glow and took several photographs. When the images were developed, they showed only dark water with no visible light. The photographer, a woman named Claire Desjardins, later said she was certain she had seen something, but that it had not registered on film. In 2006, Seattle City Light received a formal inquiry from a local historian researching the history of Diablo. The historian, a man named Douglas Treadwell, had heard multiple accounts of the underwater light and wanted to know if there were any electrical systems or structures that might explain it. Seattle City Light reviewed their records and confirmed that no electrical infrastructure remained active beneath the lake. All power lines had been removed or decommissioned before the reservoir was filled. They suggested that the reports might be caused by bioluminescence, though they acknowledged that bioluminescent organisms are rare in cold, freshwater environments and are not typically found in the North Cascades. Treadwell was not satisfied. He contacted the University of Washington's Department of Oceanography and spoke with a researcher who specialized in underwater optics. The researcher, Dr. Naomi Yoshida, explained that certain atmospheric and water conditions can create optical phenomena that resemble submerged lights. She mentioned light pillars, vertical beams of light caused by ice crystals in the atmosphere, and subsurface scattering, where light from the sky penetrates the water and reflects off suspended particles in a way that creates the illusion of a source beneath the surface. But Dr. Yoshida also noted that these phenomena typically do not produce rectangular shapes or persist for several minutes. She suggested that a site visit and measurements would be necessary to determine the cause. In 2009, a dive team from a local search and rescue organization conducted an exploratory dive at the Old Town site. The team was not investigating the light reports specifically, but was training in the area and decided to document the submerged structures. They found the remains of several foundations, concrete pads and scattered debris, metal pipes, remnants of wooden beams, and fragments of household items. They took underwater video and photographs. None of the structures had intact windows or glass. None showed any evidence of artificial light sources. The team leader, a man named Victor Rasmussen, later said the site was unremarkable and that the visibility was poor due to sediment. He was aware of the light reports, but saw nothing that could account for them. The video from the dive was reviewed by Seattle City Light and shared with Treadwell, who was still researching the phenomenon. Treadwell noted that the foundations visible in the video did not correspond exactly to the locations where witnesses had reported seeing the light. He cross-referenced historical maps of the town with GPS coordinates from the sighting reports and found a discrepancy. The light appeared to be emanating from an area where no structures had been documented as existing before the reservoir was filled. He brought this to the attention of Seattle City Light and asked if there were any undocumented buildings or infrastructure at the site. The company responded that their records were comprehensive and that any structures present before flooding had been cataloged. They offered no further explanation. In 2012, a group of 4 boaters saw the light on a calm evening in late September. One of them, a woman named Isabel Moretti, recorded a brief video on her phone. The video, later posted to a regional hiking and outdoors forum, shows dark water with a faint rectangular glow visible beneath the surface. The glow is dim and difficult to make out, but its shape is distinct. The video is 23 seconds long. Toward the end, the light fades and disappears. The video was analyzed by several forum users, some of whom suggested it was a hoax or a digitally added effect. Moretti insisted it was genuine and provided the original file for review. No definitive conclusion was reached. In 2015, Der Yoshida was contacted again, this time by a journalist writing a feature on unexplained phenomena in the Cascades. Dr. Yoshida reviewed the available reports, photographs, and video. She noted that the consistency of the descriptions, rectangular shape, faint glow, appearance at dusk, suggested the witnesses were observing the same phenomenon, whatever it was. She reiterated that no known natural process could fully explain a rectangular light source beneath the water, particularly one that appeared intermittently and only under specific lighting conditions. She suggested that the phenomenon might be related to submerged reflective surfaces, metal, glass, or other materials, that caught and redirected ambient light in unusual ways. But she also acknowledged that no such surfaces had been found during the dive. Seattle City Light declined to conduct further investigations. A spokesperson said the company had reviewed the reports and found no evidence of safety concerns or operational issues related to the reservoir. They noted that the lake is used extensively for recreation and that no other unusual phenomena had been reported. They suggested that witnesses may have been observing natural reflections, submerged debris catching light, or optical illusions caused by the unique color and clarity of the water. The reports have continued sporadically. In 2018, a kayaker saw the light and reported it to the North Cascades National Park Service, which has jurisdiction over part of the lake. The report was filed but not investigated. In 2021, a fisherman mentioned seeing it in a post on a local fishing forum. Several other users replied that they had seen similar lights on Diablo Lake over the years, but had assumed they were reflections or equipment malfunctions. Garrett Sullivan, the fishing guide who first reported the phenomenon in 1996, still works on Diablo Lake. He no longer guides in the evenings. When asked why, he says only that he prefers to be off the water before dusk. He has seen the light at least 6 times over the years, always in the same general area, always at twilight. He has stopped reporting it. He says he knows what he has seen and that it does not need explanation. He says, "It looks like a room that someone forgot to turn off." He says, "It is there, and then it is not, and that is all there is to know." Douglas Treadwell completed his history of Diablo, but left out the light reports. He said they did not fit the scope of the project and that he had no way to verify them beyond anecdotal accounts. He has never seen the light himself. He has spent hours on the lake at dusk, watching the water near the old town site, but the window has never appeared for him. He says that does not make it less real. He says absence of proof is not proof of absence. He says the lake keeps its own records written in silt and cold water, and that some of those records are not meant to be read. The old town of Diablo is still down there, foundations crumbling under pressure and time, no glass, no light, no reason for a window to glow. But at dusk, when the water darkens and the sky holds the last trace of blue, some who pass over that section of the lake still see it. Rectangular, faint, steady, a light that has no source, a window that opens onto nothing. And then, after a few minutes, it fades, and the lake is dark again. Not everyone who reaches a summit comes back down the same way they went up. Mount Shuksan rises 9,100 feet above the North Cascades of Washington State, its pyramid of ice and rock visible from as far south as Seattle on clear days. The mountain is considered one of the most photographed peaks in the world, its north face draped in glaciers that cascade down steep walls of andesite and volcanic breccia. Despite its beauty, Shuksan is a serious climb. The standard route, Fisher Chimneys, requires technical skill, ice climbing experience, and careful navigation through crevasse fields. Weather changes rapidly. Rockfall is common. Climbers who attempt the summit typically do so in teams, roped together, carrying ice axes, crampons, and helmets. Solo ascents are rare and discouraged. The mountain has claimed more than 24 lives since the early 20th century, most due to falls, avalanches, or exposure. The summit itself is a narrow ridge of snow and rock, roughly 20 feet long and 4 feet wide at its highest point. On clear days, climbers can see into Canada, across the Cascade Range, and down to the valleys far below. The ridge drops steeply on all sides. To the north, the descent is nearly vertical, a snow-covered slope that transitions into cliffs and glacier. To the south, the route back down follows a series of ridges and slopes that lead eventually to the Fisher Chimneys and the valley below. There is no other way off the summit that does not involve a fall. On the morning of August 14, 1995, a Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest Ranger named Elliot Rourke was conducting a routine patrol along the lower slopes of Mount Shuksan. He was checking trail conditions and monitoring for signs of illegal camping or resource damage. At approximately 9:30 a.m., Rourke encountered a set of boot prints in a snowpatch near the 7,500-foot elevation. The prints were fresh, clear edges, no sign of melting or wind erosion. They led upward, following the ridgeline toward the summit. Rourke noted the prints, but did not think much of them. Climbers frequently ascended Shuksan during the summer months, and it was not unusual to see evidence of their passage. Later that afternoon, Rourke was descending from his patrol when he encountered the same set of prints again, this time at a higher elevation, approximately 8,200 feet, just below the final summit ridge. The prints continued upward, evenly spaced, consistent in depth and stride. Rourke followed them for a short distance and noticed something unusual. There were no corresponding prints leading back down. The trail led up but not down. Rourke assumed the climber had descended via a different route, perhaps along the western ridge or by traversing onto the White Salmon Glacier. He made a note in his patrol log and continued his descent. 2 days later, on August 16th, Rourke was assigned to a different section of Tulpsati, the park. He mentioned the boot prints to a colleague, a ranger named Patricia Valenzuela, who had been monitoring summit activity on Shuksan that week. Valenzuela checked the summit register, a small weatherproof logbook kept in a metal canister at the top of the mountain, and found that only 2 parties had signed in during the relevant time frame. Both were groups of 3 or more climbers, and both had documented their ascent and descent routes. Neither had mentioned seeing a solo climber or encountering any unusual prints. Rourke and Valenzuela discussed the discrepancy and decided to return to the site. On August 18th, they hiked back to the location where Rourke had last seen the prints. The prints were still visible, though slightly degraded by wind and temperature fluctuations. They followed the trail upward. The prints led in a straight line toward the summit, crossing snow patches, skirting rock outcrops, and maintaining a consistent direction. At approximately 8,900 feet, just below the summit ridge, the prints became more distinct, pressed into a firm layer of névé, compacted granular snow that had survived the summer melt. The final section of the ascent required scrambling over loose rock and a short, steep snow slope. The boot prints continued. Rourke and Valenzuela reached the summit ridge and found the prints ending at the highest point of the mountain. The prints faced north, positioned at the very edge of the ridge where the slope dropped away into Kong's Shoe. There were no prints leading back, no signs of a traverse to another route, no disturbance in the snow or rock that would indicate a climber had turned around or descended in a different direction. Rourke examined the site carefully. The final print, the last clear impression, was less than 2 feet from the edge of the northern drop. The boot had pressed firmly into the snow, the tread pattern clearly visible. Beyond that point, there was nothing. No scuff marks, no signs of a slip or fall, no disturbance in the snow on the steep slope below. Rourke looked over the edge. The north face descended at a near vertical angle for more than 1,000 feet before transitioning into broken glacier and cliffs. A fall from that location would have left evidence: disturbed snow, broken rock, or debris. There was none. Valenzuela checked the summit register again. No new entries had been added. She and Rourke descended and filed a missing person report with the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office. A search and rescue operation was organized. Over the next 3 days, teams combed the mountain, focusing on the north face, the surrounding glaciers, and all known descent routes. Helicopters conducted aerial surveys. Climbing parties checked crevasses and scanned for signs of a body or equipment. Nothing was found. The investigation expanded. Authorities contacted climbing clubs, guide services, and outdoor retailers in the region to determine if anyone had reported a missing climber or sold gear to someone planning a solo ascent of Shuksan in mid-August. No one came forward. Trailhead registers from the days leading up to August 14th were reviewed. No solo climbers had signed in. Photographs taken by other climbers on the mountain during that period were examined. None showed a lone individual on the upper slopes. One detail emerged from the analysis of the boot prints themselves. A search and rescue specialist named Marcus Delgado, who had experience in tracking and forensic analysis, examined photographs of the prints and made several observations. The prints belonged to a mountaineering boot, likely a size 10 or 11. The tread pattern suggested a mid-range technical boot, common among experienced climbers. The depth and spacing of the prints indicated a person of average height and weight, walking at a steady pace without signs of fatigue or hesitation. Most notably, Delgado observed that the prints showed no evidence of return steps, side steps, or any movement other than a direct ascent to the summit. He noted that even experienced climbers pause, adjust their footing, or shift their weight when approaching a summit ridge. These prints showed none of that. They moved in a straight line without deviation to the highest point and stopped. Delgado also noted something else. The final print, the one closest to the northern edge, was pressed more deeply into the snow than the others. He suggested this could indicate that the climber had stopped and stood still for a period of time, perhaps to take in the view or to prepare for a descent. But the depth was unusual. It suggested sustained weight over several minutes, not a brief pause. Delgado could not explain why someone would stand motionless at the edge of a sheer drop for that long, especially alone, in an exposed location without leaving any other trace. Theories were proposed. Some suggested the climber had descended via an unconventional route, perhaps rappelling down the north face, or traversing onto a different section of the mountain where tracks would not be visible. But search teams found no evidence of anchor points, rope marks, or disturbed snow on any alternate routes. Others suggested the climber had fallen and that the body had tumbled into a crevasse or been buried by a subsequent snowfall. But weather records showed no significant snowfall in the week following August 14th, and crevasses in the area had been probed and searched. A more unsettling possibility was raised during a debriefing meeting. A member of the search team, a climber named Julia Sorensen, mentioned that she had heard stories from older climbers about people disappearing on Shuksan without explanation. She said the stories were vague and often dismissed as folklore, but they shared a common theme: climbers who reached the summit alone and were never seen again. Sorensen could not provide specifics or sources. She said it was something people talked about quietly, usually late at night in climbing camps, but never documented. The other team members acknowledged her comment, but did not pursue it further. The search was eventually called off on August 25th, 11 days after the prints were first discovered. Elliot Rourke kept a copy of the photographs he had taken at the summit. He later showed them to a colleague who worked as a mountaineering instructor. The instructor, a man named Gregory Falk, examined the images and noted that the final print showed no signs of a turning motion. He said that when climbers reach a summit, they almost always turn around to begin their descent. The body shifts, the feet pivot, the snow records that movement. In this case, the print faced straight ahead, toward the north, with no indication that the climber had ever turned around. Falk said it looked like the person had simply stopped walking and had not moved again. Patricia Valenzuela transferred to a different ranger district in 1997. She rarely speaks about the incident. When asked, she says only that she has climbed Shuksan multiple times since 1995 and that she always checks the summit for new boot prints. She has never found any that do not have corresponding tracks leading back down. In 2003, a photographer working on a book about the North Cascades came across the incident report while researching climbing accidents on Mount Shuksan. The photographer, a woman named Leah Tomlinson, contacted Rourke and requested copies of the photographs. She included the story in a chapter on unsolved mysteries in the Cascades, but the book received limited distribution, and the incident remained largely unknown outside of the climbing community. In 2012, a solo climber named Andrew Kerrigan reached the summit of Shuksan and later reported that he had found a single boot print in the snow near the highest point. He said the print was old, partially filled in by wind-blown snow, but still clearly visible. It faced north. Kerrigan took a photograph and posted it to a climbing forum. Several users commented that it might be a remnant of the 1995 prints, preserved by unusual weather conditions. Others suggested it was unrelated. Kerrigan did not follow up. The summit of Mount Shuksan remains a popular destination. Dozens of climbers reach it every summer. They sign the register, take photographs, and descend. Most leave boot prints that fade within days. Some leave prints that last longer, etched into firm snow or compressed into ice. And one set of prints, documented in photographs and official reports, led to the top and stopped. No body, no gear, no explanation. Just a final impression pressed deep into the snow, facing north, 2 feet from the edge where the mountain drops away into nothing. Elliot Rourke retired from the Forest Service in 2018. He still lives near the North Cascades. He no longer climbs. When asked about the prints, he says he has thought about them for more than 20 years and still does not know what happened. He says the tracks were real. He says someone walked up that mountain and did not walk back down. He says that much is certain. Everything else, he says, is only silence. Some promises outlive the people who made them. Stehekin is a settlement at the northwestern tip of Lake Chelan, accessible only by boat, float plane, or a 23-mile hike through the North Cascades. Fewer than 100 people live there year-round. There are no roads connecting Stehekin to the outside world. Mail arrives by boat. Supplies come in by ferry or are flown in during the winter when the lake freezes at the edges. The community has existed in various forms since the late 1800s, serving as a waypoint for miners, trappers, and homesteaders moving through the Cascade Range. A small church was built in 1910, and next to it, a cemetery was established for those who died in the valley and could not be transported elsewhere for burial. The Stehekin Cemetery is located on a hillside overlooking the valley, surrounded by ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. It contains roughly 40 marked graves, most dating from the early 1900s. The headstones are simple, weathered granite or wood markers inscribed with names, dates, and brief epitaphs. Many commemorate those who died in accidents common to frontier life: falling trees, drowning, illness. The cemetery is maintained informally by residents who clear brush and repair markers when needed. There is no official caretaker, no groundskeeper employed by the county or the National Park Service, which administers the surrounding land. At the northern edge of the cemetery, beneath a cluster of young aspens, is a grave that has no headstone. The plot is roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, marked only by a slight depression in the earth and a border of river stones arranged in a rectangle. The stones are smooth and deliberate, not naturally placed. The grave is clearly intentional, but there is no indication of who is buried there. Church records from the Stehekin Community Church, which date back to 1912, contain no mention of an unmarked burial. Chelan County death certificates and burial permits from the same period also contain no reference to it. Yet the grave exists, and every June 14th, wildflowers appear on it. The flowers are not planted. They are cut stems, lupine, Indian paintbrush, and wild roses, laid carefully across the stones. The arrangement is always the same: a small bundle tied with what appears to be natural twine or dried grass placed at the center of the grave. The flowers are fresh when they appear, not wilted or dried. They last several days before fading, and by the end of June they are gone, either decomposed or removed. The pattern has been observed for at least 40 years, though some residents claim it has been occurring for much longer. In 1983, a National Park Service ranger named Victor Delacroix was conducting a survey of historical sites in the Stehekin Valley. He visited the cemetery to document the graves and photograph the headstones for a cultural resources report. He noticed the unmarked grave and asked a local resident, a woman named Iris Thornton, about it. Thornton, who had lived in Stehekin since the 1950s, told Delacroix that the grave had been there as long as she could remember. She said flowers appeared on it every summer, always on the same day. She did not know who placed them. She said no one did. Delacroix assumed Thornton was mistaken or speaking metaphorically. He asked if there were any descendants of early settlers who might be maintaining the grave. Thornton said there were a few families with long histories in the valley, but none of them claimed responsibility for the flowers. Delacroix asked if the flowers could be placed by visitors, hikers, tourists, or boaters passing through. Thornton said it was possible, but unlikely. She pointed out that June 14th was not a holiday or a commonly observed date, and that Stehekin saw few visitors in early summer when the trail from the north was still snowbound and the lake was cold. She also noted that the flowers were native wildflowers, the kind that grew in the high meadows above the valley, not the sort of thing a casual visitor would carry in. Delacroix included a brief mention of the unmarked grave in his report, noting its location and the local tradition of flowers appearing annually. The report was filed with the National Park Service's Cultural Resources Office and archived. No follow-up was conducted. In 1997, a historian researching early settlements in the North Cascades visited Stehekin and came across Delacroix's report. The historian, a man named Graham Hutchins, was intrigued by the reference to the unmarked grave and decided to investigate. He spent a week in Stehekin, interviewing longtime residents and reviewing available records. He found no documentation of the grave in any official capacity. The church records, which he examined with permission from the congregation, listed every burial conducted in the cemetery since 1912. The unmarked grave was not among them. Hutchins also reviewed county death certificates and burial permits, none of which referenced an unnamed or unrecorded burial at the Stehekin Cemetery. Hutchins spoke with several residents who remembered the flowers. One man, a retired logger named Raymond Keller, said he had seen the flowers appear on June 14th every year since he moved to Stehekin in 1968. He said he had once tried to stay up all night to see who placed them, but he had fallen asleep around 3 a.m. and found the flowers there when he woke at dawn. Another resident, a woman named Margaret Silvera, said her grandmother had told her about the grave when she was a child in the 1940s. The grandmother, who had lived in Stehekin since the 1920s, had said that the grave was for someone who wanted to be forgotten but couldn't be. Silvera did not know what that meant. She said her grandmother had refused to elaborate. Hutchins also spoke with Iris Thornton, the same woman Delacroix had interviewed in 1983. Thornton was in her 80s by then, but still living in Stehekin. She repeated what she had told Delacroix. The grave had always been there, and the flowers always appeared. Hutchins asked if she knew who was buried in the grave. Thornton said she did not. He asked if anyone in the valley knew. She said no one talked about it. Hutchins pressed her. He asked why no one talked about it. Thornton hesitated and then said, "Someone's keeping a promise." She would not say more. Hutchins attempted to trace the origins of the grave by examining old photographs and maps of Stehekin. He found a photograph from 1927 that showed the cemetery from a distance. The unmarked grave was not visible in the image, but the angle and quality of the photograph made it impossible to confirm whether it existed at that time. He found another photograph from 1943 that showed a wider view of the cemetery, and in the background, near the aspens, a small rectangular plot was visible. It had no marker. Hutchins could not determine if it was the same grave, but the location matched. In 2004, Hutchins published a small article about the grave in a regional history journal. The article summarized his findings and included interviews with Stehekin residents. He concluded that the grave likely dated to the early 1900s and that its occupant was either a transient worker, a Native American individual not recorded in church records, or someone buried informally by family or friends, who later left the valley. He acknowledged that the annual appearance of flowers was unusual, but suggested it could be the work of a descendant or a local resident who preferred to remain anonymous. The article attracted little attention, but it did reach one reader who had a personal connection to Stehekin. In 2006, a woman named Elaine Pritchard contacted Hutchins via email. Pritchard's great-grandfather had been a homesteader in the Stehekin Valley in the early 1900s, and she had family letters and documents that mentioned the cemetery. She said one letter, written in 1918, referenced the grave with no name and mentioned that her great-grandfather had been asked to help dig it. The letter did not specify who was buried or why there was no marker, but it did note that the burial had occurred in June. Pritchard offered to share the letter with Hutchins. Hutchins reviewed the letter, which was written in faded ink on fragile paper. The relevant passage read, "We buried her on the 14th, just as she asked. No stone, no name. She said it was better that way. I don't know why, but I did as she wanted." The letter was signed by Pritchard's great-grandfather, a man named Samuel Locke. It was addressed to his sister in Seattle and dated June 21, 1918. The letter did not name the deceased or provide any additional context. Hutchins attempted to locate other records from 1918 that might clarify the burial. He found a church ledger from the Stehekin Community Church that listed births, deaths, and marriages for that year. No deaths were recorded in June. He contacted the Chelan County Clerk's office and requested copies of all death certificates issued for the Stehekin area in 1918. 3 certificates were on file, none dated in June. He searched local newspapers from the period, which occasionally reported deaths and funerals in remote communities. He found no mention of a burial in Stehekin in June of 1918. Hutchins returned to Stehekin in 2007 to follow up. He spoke with descendants of Samuel Locke, hoping to find additional family correspondence or oral history. The descendants knew of the letter but had no other information. One of them, a man named Douglas Locke, said that his grandfather, Samuel's son, had once mentioned the unmarked grave but had said it was not our business to talk about. Douglas said the family had always known about the grave and had assumed it was someone from outside the valley who had died and been buried quietly. He did not know why there was no record of it. Hutchins also visited the cemetery on June 14, 2007. He arrived at dawn and positioned himself where he could observe the unmarked grave without being seen. He waited until mid-morning. At approximately 8:15 a.m., he saw a figure approach the grave from the direction of the trail that led up into the high meadows. The figure was distant and partially obscured by trees, but it appeared to be a woman. She knelt at the grave, placed something on the stones, and then stood and walked back the way she had come. Hutchins tried to follow, but lost sight of her in the forest. When he reached the grave, he found the flowers, freshly cut lupine, paintbrush, and wild roses tied with dried grass. Hutchins returned to the valley and asked residents if they knew of any woman who might have been in the area that morning. No one did. He asked if any visitors had been logged arriving by boat or trail. The ferry operator and the ranger station both confirmed that no visitors had arrived in the previous 24 hours. Hutchins was certain he had seen someone. He described her as middle-aged or older, wearing what looked like a long skirt and a wide-brimmed hat, attire that seemed out of place for a hiker. The residents listened but offered no explanation. One man, Raymond Keller, said only, "You saw what you saw." Hutchins left Stehekin shortly after and did not return. He wrote a follow-up article in 2008 detailing his observations and the contents of Samuel Locke's letter. He concluded that the grave likely belonged to a woman who had died in June of 1918 and had requested an anonymous burial for reasons that were never recorded. He suggested that the flowers were placed by a family member or descendant who had maintained the tradition for nearly a century. He acknowledged that his sighting of the woman on June 14, 2007, remained unexplained. The grave is still there. The stones are still arranged in a rectangle. The depression in the earth has not filled in. And every June 14th, the flowers appear. Residents of Stehekin no longer speculate about who places them. They simply acknowledge that it happens. When asked, most decline to discuss it. Those who do speak say only that some promises are kept longer than the people who made them. They say the valley remembers things that records do not. They say the grave is not abandoned. Graham Hutchins passed away in 2016. His research on the unmarked grave was donated to the University of Washington's Special Collections, where it remains accessible to researchers. No one has followed up on his work. The cemetery is still maintained informally by residents. The unmarked grave is still there, beneath the aspens, bordered by stones. And every June 14th, someone, or something, walks up from the meadows, places fresh wildflowers on the ground, and leaves without a word. The flowers fade, the stones remain, and the name, whatever it was, stays buried. Not all footsteps on a mountain trail belong to the living. Sourdough Mountain rises 5,900 feet above the Skagit River Valley in North Cascades National Park. The trail to the summit is 5.7 miles long, gaining over 5,000 feet in elevation through dense forest, steep switchbacks, and exposed alpine slopes. The mountain was named in the late 1800s by prospectors who worked the nearby mines and survived on sourdough bread during long winters. A fire lookout was built on the summit in 1917, staffed seasonally until the 1980s, when it was replaced by aerial surveillance and decommissioned. The lookout still stands, though its windows are boarded and its interior stripped of equipment. The trail remains popular, with hikers seeking panoramic views of the North Cascades, Ross Lake, and the surrounding wilderness. The trail is divided into distinct sections. The first 2 miles climb steeply through old-growth forest, western red cedar, Douglas fir, and hemlock that block most sunlight and muffle sound. The forest floor is thick with moss and ferns. The air is cool and damp even in summer. This section is quiet. Birds are scarce. The sound of the river below fades quickly as elevation increases. Hikers describe the lower trail as oppressive, not because of difficulty, but because of the silence. It is the kind of silence that makes people aware of their own breathing, their own footsteps, and the absence of anything else. Between mile 2 and mile 4, the trail transitions from forest to subalpine terrain. The trees thin out. Huckleberry bushes and wildflowers appear. The views open up, offering glimpses of distant peaks and valleys. This section is less steep, but more exposed. Weather can change rapidly. Fog rolls in without warning. Wind picks up in the afternoon. It is also the section where hikers, particularly solo hikers, have reported hearing footsteps behind them. The first documented report came in July of 1967. A hiker named Bernard Calloway was ascending Sourdough Mountain alone on a clear summer morning. He later described the experience in a letter to a friend. Calloway wrote that he had been hiking for approximately an hour when he became aware of footsteps behind him. He assumed another hiker was following at a close distance. He did not turn around immediately, expecting the person to pass. But the footsteps did not overtake him. They matched his pace exactly. When he slowed, they slowed. When he stopped to drink water, they stopped. Calloway turned around. No one was there. The trail behind him was empty, visible for several hundred yards in both directions. He continued hiking. The footsteps resumed. Calloway wrote that the sound was unmistakable, the crunch of boots on gravel and packed earth, rhythmic and deliberate. He stopped several more times. Each time the footsteps stopped as well. Each time the trail behind him was empty. He wrote that he felt foolish but also deeply unsettled. He quickened his pace and did not stop again until he reached the summit. The footsteps did not follow him above the tree line. He spent 20 minutes at the lookout and then descended. On the way down, he heard nothing unusual. Calloway's letter was private correspondence and was not widely circulated. But in 1973, a similar report surfaced in a regional hiking magazine. A woman named Janet Kowalski wrote an article about her experience on Sourdough Mountain. She described hiking alone in late September and hearing footsteps behind her on the lower section of the trail. She turned around multiple times, but saw no one. The footsteps matched her pace. They stopped when she stopped. Kowalski wrote that she initially dismissed the sound as an echo or the noise of her own gear shifting. But the more she listened, the more distinct the footsteps became. She wrote that they sounded like someone walking 10 to 15 feet behind her, close enough that she should have been able to see them when she turned around. Kowalski's article generated several letters from readers who reported similar experiences. One reader, a man named Thomas Abelard, wrote that he had heard identical footsteps on Sourdough Mountain in 1971. He said he had assumed it was another hiker, but had never seen anyone. Another reader, a woman named Diane Silvestra, wrote that she had heard footsteps on the trail in 1972 and had turned around so many times that she eventually sat down and waited for the person behind her to catch up. No one appeared. After 10 minutes, she continued hiking. The footsteps resumed immediately. By the late 1970s, the phenomenon had become known among regular hikers in the North Cascades. It was discussed informally, mentioned in trail registers, shared around campfires, and noted in personal hiking journals. Some hikers dismissed it as auditory illusion or the sound of shifting rocks and wind. Others insisted the footsteps were real and distinct. A few refused to hike Sourdough Mountain alone. In 1981, a park ranger named Lawrence Tennyson decided to investigate. Tennyson had heard multiple reports from hikers and was curious whether the phenomenon could be explained by natural causes. He hiked the trail alone on 3 separate occasions, each time paying close attention to the sounds around him. On his second hike, he heard the footsteps. He later documented the experience in his personal log. He wrote that the sound was clear and consistent, matching his pace exactly. He stopped and counted to 30. The footsteps stopped. He resumed walking. The footsteps resumed. He turned around and saw nothing. He wrote that the trail was empty, the visibility was good, and there was no wind or animal activity that could account for the sound. Tennyson considered several explanations. He wondered if the sound was an echo, though he noted that echoes typically repeat with a delay, not in perfect synchronization. He wondered if it was the sound of rocks shifting underfoot, but he was walking on a well-maintained trail with stable footing. He also considered the possibility that he was hearing his own footsteps reflected off nearby trees or rock faces. But the forest was too dense for that kind of acoustic reflection. He concluded in his log that he could not explain the phenomenon and that it warranted further investigation. Tennyson contacted a colleague at the University of Washington, a professor of environmental acoustics named Dr. Helena Vasquez. He described the reports and his own experience and asked if she could offer a scientific explanation. Dr. Vasquez reviewed his notes and suggested several possibilities. She mentioned that forests can create unusual acoustic effects due to the density of vegetation, the presence of uneven terrain, and the way sound waves interact with organic matter. She also noted that human perception of sound can be influenced by isolation, expectation, and psychological factors. She said it was possible that hikers were hearing their own footsteps and interpreting them as coming from behind due to the acoustic properties of the environment. But Dr. Vasquez also acknowledged that Tennyson's description of synchronized, repeating footsteps that stopped and started in perfect time with the hiker's movement did not align with typical acoustic phenomena. She said that echoes, reflections, and ambient sounds do not behave that way. She suggested that a field study be conducted using audio recording equipment to capture and analyze the sound. Tennyson submitted a proposal to the National Park Service requesting funding for such a study. The proposal was denied. The Park Service stated that resources were limited and that the phenomenon did not pose a safety risk or require immediate investigation. Tennyson continued to receive reports from hikers throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. The footsteps were always heard on the lower section of the trail between mile 2 and mile 4. They were always described as matching the hiker's pace. They always stopped when the hiker stopped, and they were always reported by solo hikers, never by groups. Tennyson noted this pattern in his logs and mentioned it to other rangers, but no formal documentation was ever compiled. In 2003, a journalist writing a feature on hiking in the North Cascades came across references to the Sourdough Mountain footsteps in old hiking magazines and trail forums. The journalist, a man named Kevin Durbin, contacted Lawrence Tennyson, who had retired from the Park Service in 1997. Tennyson shared his logs and his correspondence with Dr. Vasquez. Durbin also interviewed several hikers who had experienced the phenomenon. One of them, a woman named Rita Nakamura, said she had heard the footsteps in 2001. She described them as deliberate and heavy, like someone wearing hiking boots. She said she had stopped and called out, asking if anyone was there. No one answered. The footsteps stopped. She waited. Silence. She continued hiking. The footsteps resumed. Durbin published his article in a regional outdoors magazine in 2004. The article included interviews, excerpts from Tennyson's logs, and a brief discussion of acoustic phenomena in wilderness areas. Durbin concluded that the footsteps were likely a combination of environmental acoustics and psychological factors, though he acknowledged that the consistency of the report suggested something more specific to the Sourdough Mountain Trail. The article generated moderate interest, but no formal investigation. In 2009, a graduate student in anthropology at Western Washington University, a woman named Lila Fonseca, came across Durbin's article while researching folklore in the North Cascades. Fonseca was interested in how unexplained phenomena become part of local culture and oral tradition. She contacted the Skagit tribe, whose traditional territory includes the area around Sourdough Mountain, and asked if there were any stories or warnings associated with the trail. An elder, whose name Fonseca was asked not to publish, told her that the mountain had always been considered a place where the boundary was thin. The elder said that people walking alone on certain trails might hear things that were not there or see things that should not be seen. The elder did not elaborate, but said that such experiences were not considered supernatural. They were simply part of the landscape. Fonseca attempted to hike Sourdough Mountain alone in 2010 to document her own experience. She carried audio recording equipment and hiked the trail on a clear August day. She heard nothing unusual. She hiked the trail again a week later. Again, nothing. She concluded that the phenomenon, if real, was not consistent or predictable. She included a brief mention of the footsteps in her thesis, but did not pursue further research. The reports have continued. In 2015, a hiker posted on a popular hiking forum that he had heard footsteps on Sourdough Mountain and had turned around more than 10 times without seeing anyone. Other forum users replied with similar stories, some dating back decades. In 2019, a woman wrote to the North Cascades National Park Service asking if there was an official explanation for the phenomenon. The Park Service replied that they were aware of the reports but had no explanation and no evidence to suggest anything other than natural acoustic effects. Lawrence Tennyson passed away in 2021. His personal logs, including his notes on the Sourdough Mountain footsteps, were donated to the Whatcom Museum in Bellingham, where they are archived but rarely accessed. The trail remains popular. Hikers continue to report the footsteps, though not all hikers experience them. Those who do describe the same pattern, the same stretch of trail, the same synchronized pace, the same emptiness when they turn around. One detail appears in nearly every account. The footsteps are not threatening. They do not quicken or pursue. They simply follow, matching pace, stopping when the hiker stops, resuming when the hiker resumes. They do not cross the tree line. They do not descend with the hiker. They exist only in that 2-mile stretch of dense forest where the light is dim and the silence is thick. And when hikers reach the summit, catch their breath, and look back down the trail they have just climbed, they see nothing, just the trail, just the trees, just the mountain holding whatever walks behind. Cold air does not sit still without a reason. Thunder Basin is a glacial cirque in the North Cascades, located at approximately 6,300 feet above sea level. It sits in a depression carved by ancient ice, surrounded by steep granite walls and alpine meadows that bloom briefly in summer before snow returns in early autumn. The basin itself is roughly half a mile wide, filled with talus slopes and scattered boulders deposited during the retreat of the Pleistocene glaciers. A small tarn occupies the lowest point, fed by snowmelt and seasonal runoff. The area is remote, accessible only by an unmaintained climber's route that branches off the main trail to Hidden Lake Peak. Few hikers venture there. Those who do come for solitude, not scenery. The basin has no official name on most maps. Thunder Basin is a designation used by local climbers and backcountry guides, derived from the sound that sometimes echoes through the cirque when rocks fall from the surrounding cliffs. The name appears in climbing route descriptions and backcountry trip reports, but is absent from USGS topographic maps. The Park Service does not maintain facilities or signage in the area. It is considered part of the North Cascades wilderness, unmanaged, unmonitored, and largely unvisited. In August of 1973, a team of meteorologists from the University of Washington was conducting a high-altitude climate study in the North Cascades. The team, led by Dr. Raymond Gallagher, was measuring temperature variations at different elevations to better understand microclimates in alpine environments. They set up portable weather stations at several locations, recording temperature, humidity, wind speed, and barometric pressure at regular intervals. One of the stations was placed near the center of Thunder Basin. The station recorded data for 72 hours before the team returned to retrieve it. When Dr. Gallagher reviewed the data, he noticed an anomaly. The temperature readings showed a consistent drop of 18 degrees Fahrenheit in a localized area approximately 20 feet in diameter, centered on the station's location. The drop occurred regardless of time of day, solar radiation, or ambient conditions. At noon, when the surrounding area registered 72 degrees, the station recorded 54. At midnight, when the surrounding area dropped to 48 degrees, the station recorded 30. The pattern was consistent and precise. Dr. Gallagher assumed the equipment had malfunctioned. He returned to Thunder Basin with a second weather station and placed it in the same location. The new station recorded identical readings. He then moved the station 50 feet to the east. The temperature returned to normal. He moved it back to the original location. The 18-degree drop reappeared. He tested multiple positions within a 20-foot radius of the original site. All showed the same anomaly. Beyond that radius, temperatures were consistent with the surrounding environment. Dr. Gallagher could not identify a cause. There was no shade in the area. The basin was open to the sky, with no tree cover or rock overhangs that might block sunlight. There was no wind channeling through the cirque that might create a cold draft. There were no underground streams, caves, or vents that might explain the temperature drop. The ground was solid rock and compacted soil. Dr. Gallagher examined the site carefully and found nothing unusual. He took soil samples, measured the depth of the permafrost layer, and checked for magnetic anomalies. All readings were normal. Dr. Gallagher documented his findings in a research paper published in 1974. The paper described the anomaly as unexplained and noted that the temperature drop was localized, consistent, and unaffected by external meteorological conditions. He suggested that further study was needed, but acknowledged that the remote location and lack of obvious causative factors made investigation difficult. The paper was published in a regional meteorological journal and received little attention outside academic circles. In 1981, a graduate student named Laura Fitzpatrick, working on her thesis in atmospheric science, came across Dr. Gallagher's paper. She was intrigued by the anomaly and decided to conduct a follow-up study. She hiked to Thunder Basin in July of 1981 with portable temperature sensors and a handheld anemometer. She located the site using coordinates provided in Dr. Gallagher's paper. The anomaly was still present. The temperature within the 20-foot radius was 18 degrees colder than the surrounding area. Fitzpatrick spent 6 hours at the site, taking measurements every 15 minutes. The temperature drop remained constant. Fitzpatrick noted several additional observations. First, there was no wind within the cold zone. Her anemometer registered zero airflow even when wind was detectable just outside the radius. Second, the boundary of the cold zone was sharp. She could stand with 1 foot inside the zone and 1 foot outside and feel a distinct temperature difference. Third, the cold air did not dissipate or mix with the warmer air around it. It sat in place as if contained by an invisible barrier. Fitzpatrick described the sensation in her field notes as unnatural and disconcerting. Fitzpatrick attempted to explain the phenomenon using established meteorological principles. She considered temperature inversions, where cold air settles in low-lying areas due to its higher density. But Thunder Basin was not a low-lying area. It was a cirque with open drainage, and cold air should have flowed downslope, not remained stationary. She considered katabatic winds, which occur when cold air drains down mountain slopes. But there was no wind, and the cold air was not moving. She considered the possibility of underground ice or a permafrost layer close to the surface, but her soil temperature readings showed no anomalies below ground. The cold was atmospheric, not geological. Fitzpatrick included her findings in her thesis, submitted in 1982. She concluded that the Thunder Basin anomaly was inconsistent with known atmospheric phenomena and recommended that additional research be conducted using more sophisticated equipment. Her thesis was approved, but no funding was allocated for further study. In 1990, a team of geologists from the USGS was conducting a survey of glacial features in the North Cascades. One of the geologists, a man named Vincent Rosario, had read Fitzpatrick's thesis and was curious about the cold pocket. He visited Thunder Basin with a colleague in August of 1990. They measured the temperature and confirmed the anomaly. Rosario also brought ground-penetrating radar to scan for subsurface voids or ice pockets. The scans revealed nothing unusual. The ground beneath the cold zone was solid rock, with no cavities, ice lenses, or anomalies that might explain the temperature drop. Rosario documented the visit in his field notes, but did not publish his findings. He later said in an interview that he saw no point in publicizing something he could not explain. He noted that the cold pocket posed no danger and was located in an area few people visited. He saw it as a curiosity, not a priority. In 2003, a hiker named Andrew Delgado stumbled upon the cold pocket by accident. Delgado was exploring Thunder Basin on a warm afternoon in late June. He stepped into the center of the cirque and immediately felt a sharp drop in temperature. He described the sensation in a post on a hiking forum as walking into a refrigerator. He said the cold was so intense that he could see his breath, even though the surrounding air was warm enough for him to hike in a t-shirt. He moved out of the area and the cold vanished. He moved back in and it returned. He stayed for only a few minutes before leaving, unsettled by the experience. Delgado's post attracted several replies from other hikers who had experienced the same phenomenon. One user, posting under the name Mountain Ghost, said they had encountered the cold pocket in 1998 and had assumed it was caused by an underground spring. Another user said they had felt it in 2001 and had been so disturbed by it that they had left Thunder Basin immediately and never returned. Several users speculated about possible causes: underground caves, geothermal vents, magnetic fields, but no one offered a definitive explanation. In 2007, a journalist writing a feature on unexplained natural phenomena in the Pacific Northwest contacted Dr. Gallagher, who was retired but still living in Seattle. Dr. Gallagher confirmed that the anomaly had been present in 1973 and, to his knowledge, had never been explained. He said he had returned to Thunder Basin once in the mid-1980s and had found the cold pocket still active. He said he had stopped investigating it because there was no funding, no institutional interest, and no clear path to an explanation. He described it as one of those things that exists but doesn't fit into any category we understand. The journalist, a woman named Claire Borowski, visited Thunder Basin in August of 2007. She brought a digital thermometer and a video camera. She recorded herself walking into the cold zone and measured the temperature drop. The thermometer showed a change from 68 degrees outside the zone to 50 degrees inside. Borowski described the experience as physically uncomfortable. Her skin prickled, her breath condensed in the air, and she felt an instinctive urge to leave. She stayed for less than 5 minutes. Her article, published in a regional magazine, included photographs and temperature readings, but offered no explanation for the phenomenon. In 2012, a physics professor from Eastern Washington University, Dr. Ramon Castillo, read Borowski's article and became interested in the cold pocket. He obtained permission from the Park Service to install a permanent temperature sensor at the site. The sensor recorded data continuously for 6 months, from June to December of 2012. The data confirmed that the temperature drop was consistent year-round. In summer, when ambient temperatures reached the 70s, the cold zone remained in the 50s. In winter, when ambient temperatures dropped below freezing, the cold zone dropped correspondingly, maintaining the 18-degree differential. Dr. Castillo analyzed the data and consulted with colleagues in atmospheric science, geology, and physics. None could offer a satisfactory explanation. The cold zone did not behave like any known meteorological or geological phenomenon. It did not move. It did not dissipate. It did not respond to changes in weather, solar radiation, or barometric pressure. It simply existed, maintaining its temperature differential with mechanical precision. Dr. Castillo wrote a paper summarizing his findings and submitted it to several scientific journals. All rejected it, citing insufficient data or lack of a testable hypothesis. One reviewer commented that the phenomenon was interesting but not publishable without a proposed mechanism. Dr. Castillo did not pursue further research. The temperature sensor remained in place until 2014, when it was damaged by a rockfall and not replaced. The cold pocket is still there. Hikers who visit Thunder Basin occasionally report feeling it, though many pass through the area without noticing. The boundary is sharp enough that it can be missed if a hiker does not walk directly through the center of the cirque. Those who do feel it describe the same experience: an abrupt, intense drop in temperature, confined to a small area with no apparent cause. The sensation is brief but memorable. Most move on quickly. A few linger, trying to understand. None find answers. Thunder Basin remains unmarked on official maps. The cold pocket is mentioned in scattered online forums and a few obscure academic papers, but it has never been the subject of a comprehensive study. The Park Service has no record of it. The USGS does not list it as a thermal anomaly. It exists in the margins of documentation, known to a small number of people who have felt it or measured it, but absent from any official accounting of the natural world. Dr. Gallagher passed away in 2019. His research notes, including his original data from Thunder Basin, were donated to the University of Washington archives. The cold pocket does not appear in any inventory of unexplained phenomena. It is not on any list of geological curiosities or atmospheric anomalies. It is simply there, in a remote cirque in the North Cascades, a circle of cold that has no source, no movement, and no explanation. 18 degrees colder, always, year after year, precise, unchanging, waiting. Some nights, Sleep connects strangers in ways that waking cannot explain. Colonial Creek Campground sits on the southern shore of Diablo Lake in North Cascades National Park, approximately 24 miles east of Marble Mount, Washington. The campground was established in the 1960s, shortly after the completion of Ross Dam and the creation of the Diablo Lake Reservoir. It contains 142 campsites spread across a forested area of Douglas fir, western red cedar, and hemlock. The sites are arranged in loops that follow the natural contours of the terrain, separated by dense undergrowth and connected by gravel roads. The campground is popular during summer months, but sees fewer visitors in spring and fall when temperatures drop and the trails are muddy or snow-covered. The area surrounding Colonial Creek has a long history of human presence. The Skagit people used the valley as a seasonal route between the Puget Sound lowlands and the high mountain passes. Miners and trappers passed through in the late 1800s. When Seattle City Light began constructing dams on the Skagit River in the early 1900s, the valley was transformed. Towns were relocated or submerged. Roads were built. The wilderness became a managed landscape, but the forest remained dense, the mountains steep, and the isolation profound. On the night of September 6, 2003, 4 people camped at Colonial Creek Campground. They were strangers to one another. They had arrived separately, chosen their campsites independently, and had no interaction before nightfall. Their names were Margaret Brill, a librarian from Portland; Jason Okoro, a software engineer from Seattle; Linda Vasquez, a retired teacher from Eugene; and Thomas Arneson, a graduate student in forestry from Bellingham. All 4 went to sleep between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. All 4 woke the next morning with the same memory. Margaret Brill was the first to mention it. She was packing up her tent when she encountered Linda Vasquez at the campground water pump. They exchanged pleasantries. Brill mentioned that she had slept poorly and had experienced a vivid dream. Vasquez paused. She said she had also dreamed vividly. Brill described her dream. She said she had been walking through a forest where all the trees were white, not snow-covered, but pale, as if bleached or painted. The forest was silent. There was no wind, no birds, no sound of her own footsteps. She walked until she came to a mountainside, and in the mountainside was a door. It was wooden, plain, with no handle or lock. She reached out and touched it. The door opened. She did not see what was inside because she woke up. Vasquez stared at her. She said she had dreamed the same thing. The white trees, the silent forest, the door in the mountainside. She said she had also touched the door and it had opened, and she had woken up before seeing what lay beyond. The 2 women stood at the water pump, unsettled. They agreed it was a strange coincidence, but did not dwell on it. Vasquez suggested that dreams of doors and forests were common archetypes. Brill agreed, though she remained uneasy. Later that morning, Brill and Vasquez encountered Jason Okoro at the campground exit. He was loading his gear into his car. Brill, half joking, asked if he had dreamed about white trees. Okoro stopped. He asked how she knew. Brill and Vasquez exchanged a glance. Okoro described his dream. It was identical. The white forest, the silence, the door. He said he had reached out to touch it, and it had opened, and he had felt a rush of cold air before waking. He said the dream had been so clear that he had written it down in his journal immediately upon waking, something he rarely did. The 3 of them stood together, trying to make sense of it. Vasquez suggested they check with other campers. They walked through the campground and found Thomas Arneson at his site. Arneson was sitting at a picnic table, drinking coffee. Brill approached him and asked if he had dreamed anything unusual. Arneson looked at her carefully. He asked why she wanted to know. Brill described her dream. Arneson set down his coffee. He said he had dreamed the same thing, exactly the same. The white trees, the door, the silence. He said when he touched the door, it opened, and he felt he was not supposed to remember it. He said that feeling had stayed with him after waking, an acute sense that the dream was something he should forget, but could not. The four of them sat together at Arneson's picnic table and compared their experiences in detail. The descriptions were not vague or approximate. They were precise. All four described the trees as white, not gray or silver, but a stark, uniform white. All four described the forest as silent. No wind, no animals, no ambient sound. All four described walking alone through the forest without seeing anyone else. All four described the door as wooden, plain, and set directly into the face of a mountain. All four described reaching out to touch the door and feeling it open under their hand. All four described waking immediately afterward. Arneson, who had training in cognitive science as part of his forestry research, suggested they write down their dreams separately before discussing them further. They agreed. Each person wrote a detailed account of their dream in a notebook or on paper they had with them. They did not confer or compare notes while writing. When they finished, they read the accounts aloud. The similarities were undeniable. The language varied, but the content was nearly identical. Brill wrote that the door opened without sound. Okoro wrote that it swung inward silently. Vasquez wrote that it opened as if it had been waiting. Arneson wrote that it moved inward without resistance. The four exchanged contact information and agreed to report the incident to the National Park Service. Arneson, who had worked on research projects, in collaboration with the Park Service, said he would file a formal report. The others agreed to provide written statements if needed. They left the campground that morning, each returning to their respective homes. Arneson filed a report with the North Cascades National Park Service on September 8, 2003. He described the incident and attached copies of the written accounts from all four participants. The report was received by a park ranger named Ellen Torvaldsen, who reviewed it and forwarded it to the park's chief of interpretation, a man named Gregory Strand. Strand read the report and filed it in the campground incident log. He did not conduct an investigation. In a brief memo, he noted that shared dreams are not within the purview of park management and suggested that the incident was likely a case of subconscious suggestion or environmental factors influencing sleep patterns. Arneson was not satisfied with the response. He contacted a professor of psychology at the University of Washington, Dr. Leah Pritchard, who specialized in sleep and dream research. Dr. Pritchard reviewed the written accounts and agreed to interview the four participants. She met with each of them separately over the course of 2 weeks in late September 2003. She conducted semi-structured interviews, asking about their sleep habits, their mental and physical health, their history of vivid dreams, and their recollection of the night of September 6th. Dr. Pritchard found no commonalities that would explain the synchronized dreams. None of the four had met before September 7th. None had stayed in adjacent campsites. They were scattered across different loops of the campground, separated by distances of 50 to 200 yards. None had consumed alcohol or medication that night. None had experienced similar dreams before or since. All four described the dream as unusually vivid and memorable, unlike typical dreams that fade quickly upon waking. Dr. Pritchard considered several explanations. She explored the possibility of shared environmental stimuli, sounds, smells, or atmospheric conditions that might have influenced their dreams. Colonial Creek Campground is surrounded by dense forest and sits near the shore of Diablo Lake, where the sound of water and wind can carry in unpredictable ways. But none of the participants recalled hearing unusual sounds during the night. Dr. Pritchard also considered the possibility of infrasound, low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of human hearing, which have been shown to induce feelings of unease and influence dream content. But she found no evidence of infrasound sources in the area, and the specific content of the dreams, white trees, a door, a mountain, was too detailed to be explained by abstract environmental influences. Dr. Pritchard also considered psychological explanations. She noted that all 4 participants were camping alone, which can create a sense of vulnerability and heightened awareness. She suggested that the isolation of the campground and the density of the surrounding forest might have primed their subconscious minds to generate similar imagery, forests, doors, and boundaries. But she acknowledged that this explanation did not account for the precision of the shared details or the fact that all 4 had dreamed on the same night. In her final report, completed in November of 2003, Dr. Pritchard concluded that the incident was highly unusual and not easily explained by existing models of dream generation or synchronization. She noted that while shared dream content is occasionally reported in close-knit groups or families, it is exceedingly rare among strangers with no prior connection. She recommended further study, but acknowledged that the transient nature of the event, occurring once in a specific location with no repeat occurrences, made it difficult to investigate systematically. Dr. Pritchard's report was published in a small academic journal focused on anomalous psychology. It received little attention. A few researchers contacted her with questions, but no follow-up studies were conducted. The 4 participants were not interviewed again. In 2009, a journalist writing a feature on unexplained phenomena in national parks came across Dr. Pritchard's report. The journalist, a man named Felix Moreau, contacted Margaret Brill, the only one of the 4 participants whose contact information was still current. Brill agreed to be interviewed. She said she still remembered the dream clearly, even 6 years later. She said it had not faded the way most dreams do. She said she still thought about it, especially when she was in forests or near mountains. She said she had never returned to Colonial Creek Campground. Moreau attempted to contact the other 3 participants, but was only able to reach Jason Okoro. Okoro confirmed that he remembered the dream and said it remained the most vivid dream he had ever experienced. He said he had tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but could not fully do so. He said the detail that stayed with him most was the feeling that he was not supposed to remember. He could not explain where that feeling came from or why it persisted. Moreau visited Colonial Creek Campground in August of 2009. He spoke with campground hosts and rangers, asking if there had been other reports of unusual dreams or experiences. None of the staff he spoke with were aware of any. He reviewed campground incident logs for the years surrounding 2003 and found no similar reports. He camped at the site where Linda Vasquez had stayed on the night of September 6, 2003. He did not experience any unusual dreams. Moreau's article was published in a regional magazine in 2010. It included interviews with Brill and Okoro, excerpts from Dr. Pritchard's report, and a description of the campground. The article suggested that the synchronized dreams might have been influenced by unknown environmental or psychological factors unique to the location, but offered no definitive explanation. The article generated modest interest online, with several readers posting comments about their own experiences of shared dreams, though none matched the specificity or simultaneity of the Colonial Creek incident. No further reports of synchronized dreams at Colonial Creek Campground have been documented. The campground continues to operate. Thousands of people camp there each year. Most sleep without incident. The 4 participants, Margaret Brill, Jason Okoro, Linda Vasquez, and Thomas Arneson, have not returned to Colonial Creek. They have not stayed in contact with one another. They carry the memory of the dream separately, a shared experience that exists in 4 minds, but nowhere else. The white trees, the silent forest, The door in the mountainside, the feeling of opening something that should have remained closed, the sense that they were not supposed to remember. All of it remains precise and unchanging, like a photograph developed in the dark. And somewhere in the North Cascades, in the dense forest surrounding Colonial Creek, the door, if it exists, remains unopened, waiting for the next hand to reach out and touch it. Smoke does not rise from water without fire. Baker Lake is a reservoir in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, formed in 1959 when Puget Sound Energy completed the Upper Baker Dam on the Baker River. The lake stretches 9 miles through a narrow valley, surrounded by steep forested slopes and overlooked by Mount Baker to the east. The water is deep, reaching depths of over 300 feet near the dam, and remains cold throughout the year, fed by glacial runoff and mountain streams. The lake is popular with boaters, fishermen, and campers during summer months, though its remote location and limited road access keep visitor numbers manageable. In winter, the area is largely deserted, accessible only to those willing to navigate snow-covered roads. The surrounding forest is dense, old-growth cedar, hemlock, and fir that block much of the sunlight even at midday. The valley has a history of logging, though most of the visible shoreline has been left intact. Before the dam was built, the Baker River flowed freely through the valley, and the area was used by the Nooksack and Upper Skagit peoples for fishing and seasonal travel. The flooding of the valley submerged several homesteads and logging camps, remnants of which still rest beneath the lake's surface. In July of 1988, a fishing guide named Warren Delacroix was leading a group of clients on Baker Lake. It was mid-afternoon, clear and warm, with minimal wind. Delacroix had been guiding on the lake for 12 years and knew its waters well. He later described what he saw in a written statement filed with the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office. He said he and his clients were drifting near the northern end of the lake, approximately half a mile from shore, when he noticed what appeared to be smoke rising from the water's surface. The smoke was white or light gray, distinct against the darker water and the forested shoreline beyond. It rose in a narrow column, perhaps 2 to 3 feet wide, climbing vertically without dispersing or drifting in the wind. Delacroix's first thought was that a boat had caught fire and sunk, releasing smoke from submerged wreckage. But there were no other boats in the area, and he had not heard any distress calls on his marine radio. He maneuvered his boat closer to investigate. As he approached, the smoke continued to rise, steady and unbroken, reaching what he estimated to be several hundred feet into the air, before it seemed to fade or blend into the sky. He described the smoke as behaving unnaturally, too straight, too persistent, and too localized. He said it did not spread or thin as smoke typically does in open air. It simply rose, like a column drawn with a pencil, and then disappeared. Delacroix pulled his boat to within 50 yards of the source. He could see the base of the smoke column clearly. It appeared to be emerging directly from the lake's surface, with no visible source, no floating debris, no oil slick, no disturbance in the water. He estimated that the phenomenon lasted approximately 40 to 50 seconds. Then, without any transition or fading, it stopped. The smoke did not dissipate gradually. It simply ceased, as if a valve had been closed. The surface of the lake was calm and empty. Delacroix and his clients searched the area for another 20 minutes, but found nothing. He marked the location on his GPS and returned to the marina. Delacroix reported the incident to the marina operator, who suggested he file a report with the sheriff's office in case it was related to hazardous materials or a boating accident. Delacroix did so, providing coordinates and a written description. A deputy reviewed the report and passed it to the Whatcom County Marine Patrol. A patrol boat was dispatched to the location the following day. They found no debris, no fuel residue, no signs of a fire or submerged wreckage. The water was clear and the lake bed visible at depth using sonar. The patrol filed a report noting no evidence of incident or hazard and closed the case. Delacroix mentioned the experience to other guides and regular visitors to Baker Lake. Several people told him they had seen something similar, though they had not reported it. One man, a retired logger named Eugene Pritchard, said he had seen smoke rising from the lake in the mid-1970s while fishing from shore. He described it as lasting only a few seconds and said he had assumed it was steam from a hot spring or underwater vent, though he knew there were no hot springs in the area. Another witness, a woman named Carla Tomlinson, said she had seen smoke rising from the water in 1992 while kayaking near the southern end of the lake. She said it had looked like smoke from a campfire, but there was no fire, no boat, and no source she could identify. In 2001, a group of 3 campers staying at the Horseshoe Cove campground reported seeing smoke rising from Baker Lake at dusk. One of them, a man named Michael Sorensen, took several photographs with a film camera. When the photos were developed, they showed the lake and the surrounding forest, but no smoke. Sorensen later said he was certain he had photographed the smoke and that it had been clearly visible to all 3 of them. He described it as a column of white smoke, thicker than the one Delacroix had reported, rising from the water near the center of the lake. He estimated it lasted about 30 seconds before vanishing abruptly. In 2006, a forestry technician named Angela Kerrigan was conducting a survey of shoreline vegetation along Baker Lake. She was working alone and had stopped to take water samples near the dam. She later reported seeing smoke rise from the lake approximately 200 yards from her position. She described it in her field notes as columnar, white, and persistent, lasting approximately 1 minute. She attempted to photograph it with her digital camera, but found that the smoke did not appear in the images. She reviewed the photos immediately and confirmed that the smoke, which had been clearly visible to her eyes, was not captured by the camera. Kerrigan reported the incident to her supervisor, who forwarded the information to the Forest Service. No investigation was conducted. The Forest Service was contacted in 2009 by a journalist researching unexplained phenomena in the Cascades. The journalist, a woman named Leah Ashford, had come across references to the Baker Lake smoke in online hiking forums and outdoors blogs. She requested any official reports or documentation related to the phenomenon. The Forest Service provided copies of Kerrigan's field notes and a brief incident report from 2001, but stated that they had no other records and no explanation for the sightings. A spokesperson noted that Baker Lake was a glacially fed reservoir and that temperature differentials, particularly in areas where cold glacial water mixed with warmer surface water, could produce mist or vapor that might resemble smoke. The spokesperson also suggested that witnesses might be observing condensation from submerged logs or other organic material undergoing decomposition, which can release gas bubbles that appear as disturbances on the water's surface. Ashford was not convinced. She interviewed Warren Delacroix, who was still guiding on Baker Lake. Delacroix reiterated that what he saw was not mist or vapor. It was smoke or something that behaved like smoke. He said it was too dense, too white, and too sustained to be condensation. He also noted that he had seen mist and fog on the lake countless times and that the smoke was qualitatively different. He said it moved differently, rising in a single, unbroken column rather than drifting or dispersing. Ashford also spoke with Angela Kerrigan, who confirmed her account and emphasized that the smoke had been visible to her eyes but not to her camera. Kerrigan said she had ruled out mist or condensation because the air temperature that day had been warm and there was no fog or haze anywhere else on the lake. She said the smoke had appeared suddenly, risen straight up, and then disappeared just as suddenly, with no residual haze or dissipation. Ashford attempted to contact Michael Sorensen to review his photographs, but Sorensen had moved out of state and could not be reached. Ashford obtained copies of the photographs through a mutual acquaintance. The images showed Baker Lake at dusk, with clear views of the water and surrounding trees. There was no smoke visible in any of the frames. Ashford consulted with a photographer who specialized in outdoor and nature photography. The photographer noted that smoke, particularly light-colored smoke against a darker background, should be easily captured by a camera if it is visible to the human eye. The fact that multiple witnesses had photographed or attempted to photograph the smoke without success suggested either that the smoke was an optical phenomenon not captured by camera sensors or that the witnesses were mistaken about what they saw. But the consistency of the descriptions across different witnesses and different years suggested otherwise. In 2012, Ashford published an article in a regional magazine detailing the sightings and her investigation. The article included interviews with Delacroix, Kerrigan, and Pritchard, as well as an analysis of the failed photographic attempts. Ashford concluded that the phenomenon was real but unexplained, and that the failure to capture it on camera was itself part of the mystery. She suggested that further monitoring of Baker Lake, particularly with video equipment positioned to record the lake continuously, might provide better documentation. No such monitoring was ever implemented. The Forest Service added that they did not have the resources or justification to install surveillance equipment based on sporadic and unverified sightings. Puget Sound Energy, which operates the dam and manages the reservoir, reviewed the reports but found no evidence of any operational issues or hazards that might explain the smoke. A company spokesperson noted that the dam's turbines and outflow systems were functioning normally and that there were no known vents, gas releases, or thermal anomalies in the reservoir. In 2017, a hiker named Vincent Kowalczyk reported seeing smoke rise from Baker Lake while standing on the Baker Lake Trail. He was hiking alone in late September when he stopped at an overlook to rest. He later posted about the experience on a hiking forum. He described the smoke as white and thick, rising from the water in a narrow column and climbing until it disappeared into the clouds. He said it lasted less than a minute. He said he tried to take a video with his phone, but found that the smoke did not appear in the recording. He said he watched the video immediately after and saw only the lake and sky, with no smoke visible. He said the experience left him unsettled because he knew what he had seen and could not explain why it had not been captured. Several forum users replied to Kowalczyk's post, some sharing their own sightings or linking to Ashford's article from 2012. Others suggested explanations: geothermal activity, underwater gas vents, decomposing organic matter, or optical illusions caused by atmospheric conditions. A few noted that Baker Lake sits in a seismically active region and that minor earthquakes or shifts in the lakebed might release trapped gases. But no one provided a definitive explanation, and no further investigations were launched. The phenomenon has been reported at least 8 times since 1975, according to available records and witness accounts. The sightings are sporadic, with gaps of several years between incidents. They occur at different locations on the lake and at different times of year, though most have been reported during summer and early fall. The smoke is always described as white or light gray, rising in a narrow column, lasting between 30 seconds and 1 minute, and vanishing abruptly without dispersing. And in every case where witnesses attempted to photograph or record the smoke, the images or videos showed nothing. Warren Delacroix retired from guiding in 2015. He still lives near Baker Lake. He no longer talks about the smoke unless asked directly. When asked, he says only that he knows what he saw and that he has no explanation for it. He says the lake is deep and old and that some things do not have explanations. He says he is comfortable with that. Angela Kerrigan transferred to a different district in 2010. She has not returned to Baker Lake. She says the smoke was real and that her inability to photograph it bothers her more than the smoke itself. She says it felt like looking at something that existed in a different layer of reality, visible but not recordable. She says she has stopped trying to explain it. The lake is still there, deep, cold, fed by glaciers and rain. Boaters pass over the spots where the smoke has been seen, unaware. The water is calm. The surface reflects the sky and the trees, and every few years, without warning or pattern, the smoke rises. White, silent, ascending in a column that climbs until it reaches the clouds and disappears. No one knows where it comes from. No one knows why it cannot be captured. And the lake, as always, offers no answers. Some mountains refuse to be measured. El Dorado Peak rises 8,868 feet in the North Cascades, a jagged pyramid of granite and ice visible from the Cascade River Road. The mountain was named by prospectors in the late 1800s who believed the area held gold, though no significant deposits were ever found. The peak itself is a technical climb, requiring glacier travel, steep snow slopes, and exposed rock scrambling. Its east face drops nearly 3,000 feet in less than a mile, making it one of the more dramatic alpine walls in the region. The mountain has been climbed hundreds of times since the first recorded ascent in 1933, but large sections of its terrain remain unmapped in detail due to the difficulty of access and the instability of the glaciers that cover its flanks. In the years following World War II, the United States Geological Survey undertook an ambitious project to map the wilderness areas of the Pacific Northwest with greater precision than ever before. The goal was to establish accurate topographic baselines that could be used for resource management, infrastructure planning, and future scientific research. Teams of surveyors were dispatched into remote mountain ranges throughout Washington and Oregon, carrying theodolites, measuring chains, and barometric altimeters. The work was slow and dangerous. Surveyors often spent weeks in the backcountry, establishing benchmarks and triangulation points on peaks that had never been formally surveyed. In the summer of 1947, a 4-person survey team was assigned to map El Dorado Peak and the surrounding basin. The team was led by a veteran surveyor named Douglas Whitaker, who had worked on mapping projects in the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada. The other members were Harold Tennyson, a recent graduate in civil engineering; Marjorie Callahan, one of the few women employed by the USGS at the time, trained in geodesy; and Vincent Rasmussen, a field assistant responsible for logistics and equipment. The team departed from Marble Mount on July 9, 1947, with supplies for 3 weeks. The survey proceeded normally for the first 10 days. The team established a base camp near the El Dorado Creek drainage and began the process of triangulating key points on the mountain. They set benchmarks on several subsidiary peaks and ridges using a combination of optical sighting and barometric measurements to determine elevation. Their notes from this period, which were later archived, describe routine work, clear weather, stable conditions, and measurements that aligned with expectations based on preliminary observations. On July 21st, the team attempted to establish a control point on a feature they referred to in their notes as the Southern Shoulder, a relatively flat section of ridgeline at approximately 7,500 feet. Whitaker and Callahan hiked to the site with surveying equipment while Tennyson and Rasmussen remained at base camp. According to the archived field notes, Whitaker and Callahan set up their theodolite and took an initial elevation reading. The reading was inconsistent with their previous measurements. They repeated the process. The elevation reading changed. Whitaker's handwritten notes from that day are brief but precise. He recorded that the elevation of the control point measured 7,483 feet when he took the reading alone. When Callahan took the reading using the same equipment in the same location, the elevation measured 7,512 feet. The difference, 29 feet, was far outside the margin of error for their instruments. Whitaker noted that they checked the equipment for malfunction and found none. They swapped instruments and repeated the measurements. The discrepancy persisted. When Whitaker stood at the control point and took the measurement, the elevation was lower. When Callahan stood there and took the measurement, the elevation was higher. The following day, Whitaker and Callahan returned to the site with Tennyson. All three took independent measurements. The elevation varied depending on who was operating the equipment. Whitaker recorded 7,479 feet. Callahan recorded 7,509 feet. Tennyson recorded 7,491 feet. The readings were not random. They were consistent for each individual, but they differed between individuals. Whitaker wrote in his notes, "Location appears stable, equipment calibrated, no explanation for variance." The team spent the next 3 days attempting to understand the discrepancy. They tested their instruments at other locations on the mountain and found no anomalies. They moved the control point to different positions along the ridge line. At some locations, the measurements were consistent regardless of who took them. At others, the elevation varied by as much as 35 feet, depending on the surveyor. Callahan suggested in her notes that the issue might be related to magnetic interference or localized gravitational anomalies, though she acknowledged that neither explanation was supported by the data. On July 26th, Whitaker sent a memo to his supervisor at the USGS office in Tacoma via a courier who had brought additional supplies to the base camp. The memo, which surfaced decades later in a partially declassified file, stated, "Encountered irregularities in elevation measurements on South Ridge of El Dorado Peak. Measurements inconsistent between personnel. Request guidance and possible equipment inspection. Work suspended pending resolution." The response came on August 2nd. A USGS field supervisor named Arthur Brennan hiked into the base camp with a replacement theodolite and a new set of instruments. Brennan was an experienced surveyor and had worked with Whitaker on previous projects. He later filed a report describing his visit. Brennan wrote that he tested the team's original equipment and found it to be functioning correctly. He then accompanied Whitaker and Callahan to the problematic section of the ridgeline. He took his own measurements. The elevation he recorded was 7,527 feet, higher than any of the team's previous readings. Brennan's report, portions of which remain redacted, describes the experience in restrained language. He wrote that the measurements did not conform to expected topographic consistency, and that the feature in question exhibits properties that require further investigation. He noted that the team had conducted their work professionally and that the discrepancies could not be attributed to human error or equipment failure. He recommended that the survey of El Dorado Peak be suspended and that a specialist team be brought in to assess the site. The survey was suspended on August 4, 1947. The team packed their equipment and returned to Marble Mount. Whitaker submitted a final report summarizing the work completed and noting the unresolved issues on the southern shoulder. The report was filed and marked for internal review. No specialist team was ever sent. No follow-up survey was conducted. The El Dorado Peak mapping project was quietly closed. In 1963, a cartographer named Leonard Vasquez, working on a comprehensive update of North Cascades topographic maps, came across references to the 1947 survey in the USGS archives. He requested access to the full field notes and reports. His request was partially approved. He was given access to the routine survey data, but told that certain documents related to the El Dorado project were restricted. Vasquez filed a formal inquiry asking why a routine topographic survey would contain restricted material. He received a brief reply stating that the documents contained preliminary findings that were deemed inconclusive and not suitable for public release. Vasquez did not pursue the matter further at the time, but he mentioned the incident to a colleague, a geologist named Dr. Patricia Kowalski, who had an interest in unusual geological formations. Dr. Kowalski attempted to access the restricted documents through a Freedom of Information Act request in 1978. The request was denied. The USGS stated that the documents were part of an incomplete survey and that releasing them would cause confusion regarding the accuracy of published maps. In 1989, a portion of Arthur Brennan's 1947 report was declassified and made available to researchers. The declassified section included his description of the measurement discrepancies but omitted his recommendations and conclusions. The redacted portions remained sealed. A researcher named Michael Sorensen, studying the history of early USGS surveys, reviewed the declassified material and noted the unusual nature of the case. He attempted to locate surviving members of the survey team to conduct oral history interviews. Douglas Whitaker had passed away in 1971. Marjorie Callahan had retired from the USGS in 1962 and was living in Oregon. Sorensen contacted her in 1990. Callahan agreed to be interviewed, but was reluctant to discuss the El Dorado survey in detail. She confirmed that the team had encountered measurement inconsistencies and that the survey had been suspended as a result. When Sorensen asked her to describe what she thought had caused the discrepancies, she paused before answering. She said she did not know. She said the mountain had not behaved the way a mountain should. She said it was the only time in her career that she had encountered something she could not explain using the principles of her profession. Harold Tennyson, the team's engineer, had passed away in 1983. Vincent Rasmus's son, Dieta. The field assistant was located living in British Columbia. He declined to be interviewed. Sorensen sent him a written list of questions. Rasmussen returned the letter with a single sentence written at the bottom. Some places do not want to be mapped. In 2004, a graduate student in geography, a woman named Elena Fujimoto, came across the declassified Brennan report while researching anomalies in historical cartographic data. She became interested in the El Dorado case and attempted to visit the site described in the survey notes. Using the archived coordinates, she hiked to the southern shoulder of El Dorado Peak in August of 2005. She brought a handheld GPS unit and a digital altimeter. She took multiple elevation readings at the location. The readings were consistent and matched the elevation expected based on modern topographic maps. She found no anomalies. Fujimoto concluded in her thesis that the 1947 discrepancies were likely the result of equipment limitations or atmospheric conditions that were not well understood at the time. She noted that barometric altimeters, which were the primary tool used by the survey team, are sensitive to air pressure changes and can produce inconsistent readings under certain conditions. She acknowledged, however, that the team's notes suggested they had ruled out such factors and that the pattern of the discrepancies, consistent measurements for each individual but varying between individuals, was difficult to explain using conventional meteorological or instrumental factors. In 2011, portions of Marjorie Callahan's personal field journal from the 1947 survey were donated to the University of Washington Archives following her death. The journal entries provided additional context not present in the official reports. In an entry dated July 23, 1947, Callahan wrote, "The elevation changes depending on who stands there. It is not the instruments. It is the place. Doug thinks we are making an error, but we are not. The mountain is different for each of us." In a later entry, dated July 29th, she wrote, "Brennan arrived. He measured, and the elevation was higher still. He did not say much, but I saw his face. He knows this is not normal. I do not think they will let us finish this survey." The journal entries were cataloged and made available to researchers. No official statement was ever issued by the USGS regarding the El Dorado survey or the contents of Callahan's journal. The restricted documents from 1947 remain sealed. Requests for declassification have been submitted periodically, but have all been denied. The most recent denial, issued in 2019, stated only that the documents do not meet the criteria for public release. El Dorado Peak is still climbed regularly. Modern GPS technology provides accurate elevation data for most of the mountain. The southern shoulder, where the survey team encountered the anomalies, is now covered by a different configuration of snow and ice due to glacial retreat. The exact location of the original control point is no longer identifiable. Climbers who pass through the area report nothing unusual. The mountain appears on all current maps with a clearly defined elevation and contour lines. It is treated as stable, measurable, and knowable, but in a sealed file in a government archive, there are notes written in careful handwriting that describe a place where elevation was not fixed, where the mountain measured differently depending on who was asking, and where the tools of cartography failed. And somewhere on the southern shoulder of El Dorado Peak, there may still be a spot where the ground does not agree with the instruments, where height depends on the observer, and where the mountain refuses, quietly and completely, to be reduced to numbers on a map.